The galaxy bleeds. In the wake of the Horus heresy, wounds that should have healed festered instead, and the Imperium's borders trembled under the weight of unending war. 5 centuries had passed since the War Master's fall, yet the scars remained raw. Terra still bore the marks of siege and betrayal. The Golden Throne hummed with the tortured essence of the Emperor, silent and unreachable, while his sons carried burdens too heavy for even superhuman shoulders. Rogal Dorn stood upon the bridge of the phalanx, his armor scarred, and his face carved with lines that spoke of sleepless years. The Praetorian of Terra gazed into the void where Abaddon's first Black Crusade raged like a storm of malice and desperation. The despoiler had come with hunger in his heart and vengeance burning in his eyes. Each world that fell to his advance was another dagger thrust into the Imperium's flesh. Yet it was not the enemy's fury that tormented Dorn in these dark hours. It was the silence. The Emperor had not spoken since the final moments of the siege. Not to him, not to any of his surviving sons. That silence echoed louder than any scream, more cutting than any blade. Dorn had built the walls that failed to protect his father. He had stood as sentinel and watched the light dim in those golden eyes. The iron cage still haunted his dreams. Perturabo's trap had cost him too much. 400 battle brothers lost to his pride and his need for penance. The pain glove could never cleanse what festered within him. The Codex Astartes had reorganized his legion, but it could not reorganize the guilt that ate at his soul like acid. Now Abaddon struck at the very heart of imperial space, and once more Dorn would stand as protector. Not because the Emperor commanded it. The Emperor commanded nothing anymore, but because duty remained when all else crumbled to ash, because someone had to hold the line when darkness came calling. The astropathic relay crackled to life. Captain Thulis approached, his weathered face grim beneath his helm. "My lord, we have confirmed the location of their flagship. The Sword of Sacrilege anchors their battle line 3 sectors spinward. Despoiler-class battleship, heavily modified. She carries enough firepower to crack a moon." Dorn nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the tactical display. Red icons marked the enemy fleet like drops of blood against the starfield. At their center, the Sword of Sacrilege pulsed with malevolent energy. Abaddon commanded from that vessel, the spawn of the War Master's corruption, the heir to Horus's madness. The symmetry was not lost on him. "Ready 3 companies for boarding action," Dorn commanded, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "We take that ship. We cut off the serpent's head." Thulis hesitated. The captain had served under Dorn for 2 centuries, had seen him weather storms that would break lesser men. Yet even he could not hide his concern. "My lord, the enemy outnumbers us 10 to 1. Their ship is a fortress. We could bombard from range, disable their drives. No." Dorn's gauntleted hand tightened on his chain-sword's grip. The weapon had tasted traitor blood on the walls of Terra itself. It would taste it again. Abaddon must die. His death will break their resolve. Half measures will only prolong the suffering. The captain bowed his head. "It will be done, my lord." As the imperial fists prepared for battle, Dorn felt the familiar weight of command settle upon him. It was a burden he had carried since the Emperor first found him on Inwit, through the Great Crusade, through the dark days of the heresy, through the long years of rebuilding that followed. Always the protector, always the shield between humanity and the dark. Yet something felt different this time, a whisper at the edge of perception, like a distant voice calling through the warp. For a moment, he thought he heard. But no. The Emperor was silent, had always been silent, would always be silent. The Thunderhawks launched from the Phalanx's bays like golden meteors, carrying the finest warriors of the 7th Legion toward their destiny. Dorn rode in the lead craft, surrounded by veterans whose loyalty was absolute and whose skill was unmatched. Each bore the scars of 100 battles. Each had stood with him through the darkest hours. If he was to die this day, he could ask for no finer company. The sword of sacrilege loomed before them, a monument to corruption and hatred. Its hull was scarred with blasphemous runes that writhed and pulsed with unnatural life. Weapon batteries tracked their approach like predatory eyes. Point defense turrets spat streams of fire that lit the void like deadly stars. 3 Thunderhawks died in the first wave, their crews vaporized in blossoms of superheated plasma. Dorn's transport shuddered under the impact of lass fire and solid rounds. The hull groaned but held. His warriors checked their weapons with practiced efficiency. Bolters, chains wards, power fists, the tools of their trade, the instruments of the Emperor's will made manifest. 60 seconds to impact, the pilot announced over the comm. His voice was steady, despite the hurricane of fire around them. Dorn closed his eyes and felt the weight of memory, the walls of terror rising under his command, the pride in his father's eyes when the defenses were complete, the horror as those same walls were breached, as traitors poured through gaps his design had failed to prevent. The final moments when Horus fell and victory came at the cost of everything that mattered. He had failed once. He would not fail again. The Thunderhawk struck the enemy hull like a hammer blow. Boarding torpedoes punched through armored plating, creating breaches that the Imperial fists poured through like an avenging tide. Dorn was first through the gap, his chains ward screaming as it carved through the first wave of defenders. Traitor Astartes fell before him, their corruption no match for his righteous fury. The corridors of the Sword of Sacrilege were a maze of twisted metal and blasphemous architecture. Chaos had remade the ship in its own image, turning passages into arteries of living flesh and chambers into organs of malice. The air tasted of copper and decay. The walls whispered with voices that spoke of damnation and despair. Dorn pressed forward, his warriors at his side. They moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine, each battle-brother covering his brothers as they advanced. Bolter rounds echoed like thunder in the narrow spaces. Chains wards shrieked against corrupted armor. Blood, both loyal and traitor, painted the walls in crimson testimony to the struggle. 3 companies had entered the ship. Now barely 2 companies remained. The enemy was endless, pouring from hidden passages and concealed alcoves like a plague of insects. Yet Dorn pushed on. The bridge lay ahead. Abaddon waited. Justice demanded satisfaction. Hours passed in a blur of violence and death. Dorn's armor was cracked in a dozen places, his chains ward's teeth dulled by constant use. Exhaustion weighed on him like lead, but still he fought. Still he led. Because that was what he was. The Praetorian. The Guardian. The shield that never breaks. The bridge doors loomed before them, wreathed in fell energies that made the air itself recoil. Beyond those portals waited the despoiler, the heir to Horus's madness. Dorn raised his chains ward and spoke the words that would open the way. "For the Emperor," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber like a bell tolling for the dead. The doors exploded inward under the force of melter charges. Dorn stepped through the breach and into legend. Abaddon waited for him on the command throne, resplendent in his Terminator plate, and wreathed in the malevolent power of the dark gods. The talon of Horus gleamed on his left hand. Drachnian, the demon's sword, pulsed with hunger in his right. Around him stood his chosen, the greatest of his warriors, their eyes burning with the light of damnation. "Dorn," Abaddon spoke, his voice a rumble of thunder and brass. "The Emperor's lapdog comes to bark at his betters." "I come to end you," Dorn replied, raising his chains ward, "as your master should have been ended long ago." They circled each other like titans preparing for war. The bridge fell silent, save for the hum of corrupted machinery and the whisper of the warp. Two sons of two fathers faced each other across the gulf of ideology and hatred that had torn the galaxy apart. Abaddon struck first, Draconian cutting through the air with supernatural speed. Dorn parried, his chains ward screaming against the demon blade in a shower of sparks. The talon of Horus swept around in a crushing blow that would have shattered ceramite armor, but Dorn twisted aside, his riposte carving a gouge across the despoiler's breastplate. They fought with the fury of gods and the precision of master craftsmen. Each blow carried the weight of worlds. Each parry decided the fate of systems. Around them, their warriors clashed in a melee that shook the very foundations of the ship. Dorn was skilled beyond measure, his blade work a testament to centuries of war. Yet Abaddon had the blessing of the dark gods, their power flowing through him like poison wine. Slowly, inexorably, the despoiler began to gain the advantage. The talon of Horus found its mark at last, crushing through Dorn's left pauldron and driving him to one knee. Draconian followed, its edge parting his gorget and drawing a line of fire across his throat. Blood, ancient and noble, spilled upon the deck. "You die as your emperor dies," Abaddon snarled, raising the demon sword for the killing blow. Slowly, painfully, forgotten by the galaxy you tried to save. Dorn looked up at his killer, his vision blurring from the blood loss. In that moment, he saw not Abaddon, but Horus. Not the despoiler, but the War Master. The cycle repeating, as it always did. As it always would. Yet something stirred in the darkness at the edge of perception, a voice, distant but unmistakable. A whisper that cut through the cacophony of war like a blade through silk. "You are not done, my son." The Emperor's voice. Impossible. Forbidden. Real. Power flooded through Dorn like molten gold, washing away pain and exhaustion in a tide of divine fury. His chainsword blazed with inner fire as he rose to face his enemy. Abaddon's eyes widened in shock and fear as the Praetorian stood transfigured, wreathed in the light of Terra's sun. The killing blow never fell. Dorn's blade took Abaddon's sword arm at the shoulder, Draconian tumbling from nerveless fingers. The talon of Horus cracked under the impact of the Praetorian's fist. The despoiler staggered, his armor weeping promethium from a dozen breaches. In that moment of triumph, the bridge doors burst open once more. Captain Lysander led the charge, his thunder hammer crackling with energy. Behind him came the survivors of the Second Company, their weapons blazing as they poured fire into the remaining enemy. The battle turned in an instant, chaos giving way to imperial discipline. Abaddon fell back toward the escape pods, his forces in disarray. The despoiler's eyes met Dorn's across the carnage, burning with hatred and a promise of future vengeance. "This is not over, Dorn," he snarled as he activated the pod systems. "The long war has only begun." The escape pod ejected into space, carrying the architect of the crusade to safety. Around them, the sword of sacrilege shuddered as explosions tore through its hull. The ship was dying, its crew fleeing in whatever craft they could find. Dorn stood among the wreckage, his armor still glowing with the residual power of his father's touch. The Emperor had spoken. After 500 years of silence, he had spoken. 3 words that changed everything. "You are not done." As the Imperial fists evacuated the dying ship, Dorn pondered those words. What did the Emperor want of him? What purpose remained for a guardian who had failed in his greatest duty? What destiny awaited the son who had heard his father's voice, beyond the veil of silence. The answers would come in time. For now, it was enough that he lived, that his warriors lived, that the enemy was broken and scattered. The first Black Crusade had failed. Its architect fled into the void. The Imperium endured, as it always endured. Yet in his heart, Dorn knew that everything had changed. The Emperor's silence had been broken. The divine will had stirred once more. And somewhere in the darkness between the stars, destiny was reshaping itself around the simple fact that Rogal Dorn had not died this day. The phalanx took him home to Terra, but the man who returned was not the same as the one who had left. In the depths of his soul, a fire had been lit that would never again be extinguished. The Praetorian lived. The Emperor had spoken. And in the grim darkness of the far future, that made all the difference. The phalanx drifted through the void like a golden mountain, its hull scarred by the violence that had claimed so many of its children. In the depths of the fortress monastery's apothecarion, Rogal Dorn lay suspended between life and death, his body racked by wounds that should have killed even a Primarch. The Emperor's voice still echoed in his mind, those 3 words burning brighter than any star. "You are not done." Chief Apothecary Mendix worked with hands that had tended the Legion's wounds for 3 centuries. He had seen battle brothers rise from injuries that would fell a Titan. He had witnessed the resilience of Astartes' physiology pushed to its absolute limits, yet never had he seen damage like this. The Praetorian's body bore the marks of Dracnian's edge, wounds that festered with the corruption of the warp itself. "How long?" Captain Lysander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The veteran warrior stood vigil beside his Gene father's healing chamber, his own injuries forgotten in the shadow of Dorn's condition. Mendix adjusted the nutrient feeds and monitoring devices with practiced precision. The machines hummed their litanies of life, each beep a small victory against the darkness that sought to claim their lord. Weeks, perhaps months. The daemon blade left its mark deep. His body fights not just physical trauma, but spiritual corruption. Yet even as the apothecary spoke, something stirred within the healing chamber. Dorn's eyes opened, not with the confusion of one awakening from dreams, but with the clarity of purpose that had defined him since the first days of the Great Crusade. The golden light that had blazed around him during his battle with Abaddon flickered at the edges of his vision, a reminder that his father's will still coursed through his veins. "My lord," Lysander stepped forward, relief and concern warring across his weathered features. "You should not attempt to move. The injuries will heal," Dorn interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. He began to rise from the healing slab, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to dance with inner fire. "The Emperor's work is not finished, neither is mine." The months that followed were a testament to the superhuman will that had made Dorn legend. Each day brought new trials as his body knitted itself back together. Primarch physiology working miracles that even the Legion's finest medical minds could not fully comprehend. Yet it was not the healing of flesh that marked this time of recovery. It was the transformation of spirit. Word of their Primarch's survival spread through the imperial fists like wildfire through dry timber. Battle brothers who had prepared to don the black of mourning instead found their hearts ablaze with renewed purpose. Their Gene father lived. The Praetorian endured. In the grim darkness of the 31st millennium, that was miracle enough to sustain them through any trial. Captain Tor Garadon was among the first to request audience once Dorn could receive visitors. The siegemaster knelt before his lord with tears streaming down his scarred cheeks, his voice thick with emotion he could not contain. "We thought you lost to us, my lord. the Legion prepared for the long watch without its father. Yet here you stand, blessed by the Emperor's own hand." Garadon's words carried the weight of collective grief, transformed to joy. "How do we serve? What would you have of us?" Dorn regarded his son with eyes that held depths they had not possessed before his ordeal. The experience of hearing the Emperor's voice had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. Where once duty had been a chain that bound him to Terra's service, now it was a choice freely made each day anew. "We serve as we have always served," Dorn replied. Yet something in his tone suggested that service itself might be redefined. "But we serve with wisdom, not merely obedience. We ask not only what must be done, but whether it should be done." The distinction was lost on neither Garadon nor the other captains who had gathered to witness their Primarch's recovery. Such words would have been unthinkable from the Dorn they had known before the Sword of Sacrilege. The Praetorian had always been the most dutiful of sons, the one who questioned least and obeyed most completely. This subtle shift in philosophy sent ripples through the Legion's command structure, like cracks through a wall under stress. Yet it was not only his sons who took note of Dorn's survival. Terror itself stirred with the implications of what had transpired in the void. The High Lords of Terror had prepared for a galaxy without the Praetorian. Plans had been made, contingencies activated, power structures realigned to account for his absence. His return from death's door was not merely unexpected, it was inconvenient. Lord Commander Militant Draken Vangorich was the first to make the journey to the Phalanx. The Master of the Assassinorum arrived with a small retinue and expressions of concern that masked calculations of political advantage. He found Dorn in the Fortress Monastery's great chapel, kneeling before the Emperor's image in silent communion. "Lord Dorn," Vangorich announced himself with appropriate deference, "the Senatorum Imperialis rejoices in your recovery. The Imperium has great need of your wisdom in these dark times." Dorn did not immediately respond. He remained motionless before the golden idol, his lips moving in prayers that no mortal ear could discern. When he finally rose and turned to face his visitor, Vangorich felt the weight of those ancient eyes like a physical force. "Do they rejoice?" Dorn asked, his voice carrying no accusation, yet somehow managing to convey volumes. "Or do they recalculate? Do they celebrate my return, or mourn the disruption of their careful plans?" The directness of the question took Vangorich by surprise. The Dorn, he remembered, would never have spoken so openly about political maneuvering. The Dorn had concerned himself with walls and weapons, leaving the subtleties of governance to others more suited to such work. "The High Lords serve the Emperor's will," Vangorich replied carefully. "As do we all." Indeed. Dorn moved past the assassin toward the chapel's great windows, which offered a view of the stars beyond. "Tell me, Lord Commander, what is the Emperor's will? How do we divine his desires when he speaks to none of us? When his silence stretches across centuries like a vast void?" Vangorich followed, his mind racing to interpret this new version of the Praetorian. The Emperor's will is manifest in the Imperium itself, in its survival, in its expansion, in the protection of humanity from the threats that would destroy it. "Is it?" Dorn's reflection stared back at him from the armored glass, a spectre of the man he had been. Or have we confused our interpretation for his intent? Have we built a monument to our own understanding and called it divine will? The questions hung in the air between them like incense, heavy with implications that Vangorich dared not fully acknowledge. To question the Imperium's structure was to question the foundation upon which the High Lord's authority rested. To suggest that their interpretation of the Emperor's will might be flawed was to open doors that had been sealed since the end of the heresy. The Imperium endures, Vangorich said at last, falling back on the certainties that had guided imperial policy for 5 centuries. That is achievement enough. Endurance is not the same as purpose, Dorn replied. He turned from the window to face Vangorich directly, and in that moment the assassin glimpsed something that chilled him more than any weapon. This was not the dutiful son who had built the walls of terror. This was something new, something transformed by an experience that Vangorich could not hope to understand. "The Emperor spoke to me," Dorn said simply. 3 words. "You are not done." I have spent weeks in meditation, seeking to understand their meaning. What work remains unfinished? What purpose justifies my continued existence when so many better men have fallen? Vangorich felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, like a fortress undermined by patient siege work. Perhaps the meaning is simple, my lord. Perhaps he meant only that your service to the Imperium continues. Perhaps. Dorn's tone suggested he found such simplistic interpretation insufficient. Or perhaps he meant something more. Perhaps he sees what we have become and finds it wanting. Perhaps he weeps for the children we might have been. The heretical nature of such thoughts struck Vangorich like a physical blow. To suggest that the Emperor might disapprove of the Imperium's development was to question the very foundations of imperial doctrine. Yet the words came from Rogal Dorn himself, the most loyal of sons, the one whose devotion had never wavered even in the darkest hours. "I should return to Terra," Vangorich said, his voice carefully controlled. "The High Lords will be eager for a full report on your condition." "Tell them I live," Dorn replied. "Tell them I serve. But tell them also that service may take forms they do not expect. Tell them that the Emperor's silence has taught me the value of listening." Vangorich departed the phalanx with more questions than answers, his mind churning with the implications of what he had witnessed. The Praetorian's survival was a gift to the Imperium, but it was also a complication that could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. In the days that followed his visitor's departure, Dorn found himself drawn again and again to the great chapel. He knelt before the Emperor's image for hours at a time, seeking some sign, some further communication that might clarify his purpose. The golden idol remained silent, as it always had, as it always would. Yet in that silence, Dorn began to find something he had never expected. Peace. Not the peace of the grave that he had almost found aboard the Sword of Sacrilege, but the peace of acceptance. He had spent 5 centuries flagellating himself for failures, real and imagined, the walls that fell, the brothers that died, the father who suffered in eternal agony because his son had not been strong enough, fast enough, wise enough to prevent catastrophe. Yet the Emperor's voice had called him back from death itself, not to punish him for past failures, but to give him opportunity for future service. The distinction was profound, for it suggested that his father saw in him potential for redemption, for growth, for transformation into something greater than he had been. Captain Lysander found him there on the 7th day after Vangorich's departure, still kneeling, still praying, still listening to the silence that spoke louder than any words. "My lord," Lysander approached, with the careful respect due to both genetic father and spiritual guide. "The Legion awaits your orders. We have scattered the enemy, but other threats gather in the darkness. The Orcs mass in the Armageddon system. Eldar raiders strike at our shipping lanes. The galaxy burns and your sons stand ready to answer the call." Dorn rose slowly, his joints protesting after hours of motionlessness. When he turned to face Lysander, the captain saw something in his gene father's eyes that had not been there before. Not just determination or duty or the unyielding resolve that had made him legend. Something deeper. Something that looked almost like hope. Then we answer, Dorn said. But we answer with wisdom as well as strength. We ask not only how to win, but what victory should look like when the last shot is fired. Lysander bowed his head in acknowledgement, though confusion flickered across his features. The Praetorian had always been a pragmatist, concerned with the immediate necessities of defense and construction. This talk of greater purpose was new, strange, almost unsettling in its implications. Yet as they left the chapel together, walking toward the command center where the Legion's future would be planned, neither fully understood that they were witnessing the birth of something unprecedented. The old Dorn would have asked what needed to be built, what walls required strengthening, what enemies demanded destruction. This new Dorn asked different questions, questions that would reshape not only the imperial fists, but the imperium itself. The Emperor had spoken 3 words that changed a life. In time, they would change a galaxy. The work was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. The years following Dorn's resurrection from the sword of sacrilege marked a subtle but profound shift in the currents of imperial governance. Where once the Praetorian had been content to serve as terror's shield, responding to threats with unwavering loyalty, he now began to question not merely how battles should be fought, but why they needed fighting at all. The Emperor's voice had awakened something in him that centuries of dutiful service had not touched, a capacity for growth. The first sign of change came during the Mordian Rebellion in 547 M31, when the Taumaran sector declared independence from imperial rule. The traditional response would have been swift and brutal, orbital bombardment, followed by mass executions to serve as warning to other potential dissidents. Yet when the War Council convened aboard the Phalanx, Dorn listened not only to intelligence reports of rebel strength, but to the underlying causes that had driven loyal citizens to revolt. They cite overtaxation and forced conscription, reported Castellan Draco, his scarred features reflecting decades of compliance enforcement. Standard grievances: the Lord Governor estimates 12 billion souls in open rebellion. He requests immediate sanctions to restore order. Dorn studied the tactical displays with the same methodical precision that had made him master of siege warfare. Yet his conclusions surprised even his most veteran officers. What does the data tell us of their actual capability to resist? Not their numbers, but their resolve. Not their weapons, but their cause. Captain Lysander, standing at his Gene father's right hand, consulted the intelligence archives with growing bewilderment. My lord, their military capacity is negligible. Colonial PDF with light armor and limited air support. They could be pacified within weeks using conventional doctrine. That is not what I asked. Dorn's voice carried the weight of authority, but also something new, a patience that sought understanding rather than mere compliance. I asked about their resolve, their reasons. What drove citizens of the Imperium to risk everything in futile rebellion? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that made the assembled officers uncomfortable. Such concerns had never troubled the Praetorian before. His duty had been simple: identify threats, eliminate them, rebuild what was destroyed. This new tendency to examine root causes suggested a dangerous evolution in his thinking. After reviewing the full diplomatic records and economic analyses, Dorn reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable from his former self. Instead of crushing the rebellion through superior firepower, he chose to negotiate. Not from weakness, but from a growing understanding that strength, poorly applied, was often indistinguishable from tyranny. The negotiations took place on the orbital platform above Mordian Prime. Dorn met with the rebel leadership, not as conqueror prepared to dictate terms, but as the Emperor's representative, seeking to understand how the Imperium had failed its people so completely. The rebel leaders, expecting death or imprisonment, found themselves instead invited to explain their grievances to one of the most powerful men in the galaxy. "You speak of overtaxation," Dorn said, reviewing the economic data they had provided. His massive frame seemed almost too large for the diplomatic chamber, yet his manner was careful, measured. "Yet the tithes demanded of Mordian are within standard parameters. What makes them unbearable here when other worlds manage to comply?" Minister Hayden, the rebellion's primary spokesman, looked uncertain how to address a Primarch who actually seemed interested in his answers. "My lord, the standard parameters assume certain population levels and industrial capacity. Mordian has suffered 3 plague outbreaks in the past decade. Our workforce is depleted, our infrastructure damaged, yet the tithe demands remain unchanged." The admission revealed a fundamental flaw in the imperial system that Dorn had never previously considered. The Administratum's bureaucratic machinery was designed for stability and consistency, not adaptation to local circumstances. A world could be devastated by war, disease, or natural catastrophe, yet still face the same tribute demands as if nothing had changed. "And the forced conscription?" Dorn continued, his questions guided not by judgment, but by genuine desire to understand. "We have already given our sons to 3 separate crusade fleets," replied General Vox, a woman whose military bearing commanded respect even in defeat. "Mordian Iron Guard regiments serve across the galaxy. Yet the Departamento Munitorum continues to demand more recruits from a population that can barely sustain itself." As the negotiations progressed, Dorn found himself confronting an uncomfortable truth. The rebellion had arisen not from treachery or corruption, but from the Imperium's inability to distinguish between necessary sacrifice and systematic exploitation. The very efficiency that made the imperial machine function across 1,000,000 worlds also made it incapable of recognizing when that efficiency became counterproductive. The resolution he proposed shocked both sides. Rather than punishment or unconditional surrender, Dorn implemented a graduated restoration plan. Mordian's tithes would be reduced for a decade while the world rebuilt its infrastructure. Conscription would be suspended until population levels recovered. In return, the rebel leadership would work with imperial administrators to develop more responsive governance protocols. "You reward treason," accused Cardinal Morven when news of the settlement reached Terra. The ecclesiarchy's representative had journeyed to the Phalanx specifically to register his outrage. "You encourage dissent across the galaxy by showing mercy to those who defy the Emperor's will." Dorn received the Cardinal in his private study, surrounded by treatises on fortification, governance, and philosophy that would have seemed foreign to the man he had been before the sword of sacrilege. The room itself reflected his evolving perspective: architectural plans, shared space with demographic studies and economic analyses. "I serve the Emperor's will," Dorn replied, his tone carrying no defensiveness, only certainty. "But I have begun to question whether we truly understand what that will encompasses. Does the Emperor desire the submission of his people, or their flourishing? Does he value obedience, or loyalty freely given?" Cardinal Morven's eyes blazed with the fervor that had become increasingly common among the ecclesiarchy's leadership. "The Emperor's will is manifest in imperial doctrine. To question that doctrine is to question the divine order itself." "And if that doctrine was written by men?" Dorn asked. "If it represents not the Emperor's perfect vision, but our imperfect interpretation of his silence. What then becomes our duty? The theological implications of such questions struck at the foundation of imperial orthodoxy. For 5 centuries, the emperor's silence had been filled by institutional interpretation. The high lords claimed to speak with divine authority. The ecclesiarchy preached absolute obedience to their understanding of the emperor's wishes. Yet here was one of the emperor's own sons suggesting that such claims might be premature at best, blasphemous at worst. "You walk a dangerous path, Lord Dorn," Morven warned as he prepared to depart. "The faithful will not long tolerate such philosophical flexibility from their leaders." After the cardinal's departure, Dorn found himself drawn once again to his private meditation chamber. The space was Spartan, even by Astarte's standards, a simple alcove containing only a kneeling mat and a small shrine to the emperor. Here, in the silence between the stars, he wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. The emperor's voice had spoken to him once, briefly, at the moment when death seemed certain. 3 words that had changed everything. Yet in the months since, there had been only silence. No further guidance, no clarification of purpose, only the echoing memory of divine intervention and the responsibility that came with it. In these quiet hours, Dorn often found his thoughts turning to his brother Guilliman and the great work of codification that had shaped the post-heresy imperium. The Codex Astartes had brought order from chaos, structure from anarchy, yet Guilliman's vision had encompassed more than military organization. He had dreamed of an imperium that could grow and adapt, that could become something greater than mere survival. What would Guilliman think of the imperium now? Would he approve of the rigid orthodoxy that had calcified around his reforms? Or would he, like Dorn, begin to question whether preservation of the status quo was truly the highest form of service to their father's vision? The questions multiplied like cells dividing, each spawning new uncertainties. If the emperor had wanted a static, unchanging realm, why had he created the Primarchs with such diverse talents and perspectives? If he had desired only obedience, why had he gifted them with the capacity for independent thought? The very existence of the Primarchs suggested that the emperor valued growth, evolution, the potential for his creations to surpass their original limitations. This philosophical evolution began to manifest in practical changes to how Dorn governed his own forces. The imperial fists had always prided themselves on discipline and adherence to protocol. Yet now their Primarch introduced innovations that would have seemed radical to previous generations. Recruitment protocols were modified to emphasize critical thinking alongside physical prowess. Training regimens included studies of civilian governance and economic theory, not merely the arts of war. Captain Lysander observed these changes with growing concern. "My lord, the Legion has served well under existing doctrines for centuries. Are such modifications truly necessary?" Dorn looked up from the training manual he was reviewing, its pages marked with his personal annotations in precise, high Gothic script. Necessary? Perhaps not. But improvement is possible, and possibility demands action. We can be better than we have been. Should we not strive for that betterment? But the risk of change, my lord, if existing methods function adequately. Adequacy is not excellence, Dorn interrupted gently. And excellence is what the Emperor deserves from his sons. Not mere compliance, but genuine growth toward our highest potential. The implications of such thinking extended far beyond the imperial fists. If a Primarch could evolve, could improve upon the foundations laid by the Emperor himself, what did that suggest about the rest of the Imperium? Could the vast machinery of governance, the ancient protocols of the administratum, the sacred traditions of the ecclesiarchy, could all of these be subject to improvement as well? Word of Dorn's innovations spread through the imperial hierarchy like ripples in still water. Some viewed his reforms with interest, seeing in them potential solutions to problems that had festered for centuries. Others saw dangerous precedent, a crack in the foundation that could bring down the entire structure of imperial authority. The tension came to a head during the Conclave of Titan, when representatives from across the segmentum gathered to address the growing unrest that seemed to follow in Dorn's wake. Not rebellion. His example had made that unnecessary. But questions, challenges to accepted wisdom, requests for reforms that echoed the Mordian precedent. High Admiral Quarren spoke for the conservative faction when he addressed the assembly. Lord Dorn's compassion is admirable, but compassion without strength invites chaos. Already we see the effects of his mercy. 12 systems have petitioned for reduced tithes. 7 have requested suspension of conscription quotas. How long before the Imperium lacks the resources to defend itself? Yet others saw different implications in the data. Those same systems show increased voluntary recruitment, countered Governor Militant Vasson. Population growth has accelerated. Economic productivity rises when people believe they serve a just cause rather than an exploitative machine. The debate raged for days, revealing fractures in the imperial hierarchy that had been hidden beneath centuries of unquestioning obedience. Yet at its heart lay a single question that no amount of rhetoric could resolve. What would the Emperor truly want from his servants? As news of the debate reached him aboard the phalanx, Dorn felt the weight of unintended consequences settling upon his shoulders like a mantle of lead. His attempts at reform had unleashed forces he could not easily control. The Imperium was stirring from its dogmatic slumber, and the awakening was not without pain. In the privacy of his chambers, kneeling before the Emperor's image, Dorn spoke words that no one else would ever hear. Father, I hear your silence louder than any voice. I feel your absence more keenly than any presence. Yet still I must choose. Still I must act. Guide me, if you will, or leave me to find my own path in the darkness you have left behind. The Emperor's image regarded him with golden eyes that revealed nothing. The silence stretched on, vast and unbroken. Yet in that silence, Dorn began to hear something new. Not answers, but permission. Permission to question. Permission to grow. Permission to become something greater than what he had been. The transformation of the Praetorian continued, day by day, choice by choice. Each decision carved new channels through which the future might flow. Each reform opened possibilities that had been closed since the Emperor's placement upon the Golden Throne. The work of building a better imperium had begun, though its architect was only beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had set in motion. In the grim darkness of the 31st millennium, hope was a dangerous thing. Yet hope, once kindled, proved remarkably difficult to extinguish, and in the heart of Rogal Dorn, hope burned with the intensity of a star. The storm that had been gathering since Dorn's resurrection finally broke in the 3rd year following his survival aboard the Sword of Sacrilege. What began as whispered concerns in the corridors of power had grown into open resistance, coordinated opposition that struck at the very foundations of the reforms the Praetorian had championed. The Imperium was learning to fear its own protector. High Lord Goge van Dyre observed the tactical displays from his position in the Senatorium's war room with the cold calculation that had elevated him through the ranks of imperial hierarchy. Before him spread reports from across the galaxy, worlds petitioning for reduced tithes, sectors requesting modified conscription protocols, entire sub-segments adopting governance reforms that echoed Dorn's Mordian precedent. The pattern was unmistakable and deeply troubling. 47 systems in Segmentum Solar alone, reported Adept Primus Kellak, his augmetic voice carrying undertones of mechanical disapproval, each citing Lord Dorn's interventions as justification for their requests. The administrative burden of processing individual petitions threatens to overwhelm the Departmentum Munitorum's capacity. Van Dyer nodded slowly, his fingers steepled before his thin lips. The man who would one day reshape the ecclesiarchy according to his own vision already possessed the calculating mind that marked him as dangerous. Yet now that mind focused not on personal advancement, but on what he perceived as existential threat to imperial stability. Dorn has become a symbol, Van Dyer mused, his words carrying the weight of careful analysis. Not of strength, but of weakness. His mercy toward rebels encourages dissent. His questioning of established protocol undermines the very foundations of imperial authority. Something must be done. The assembled officials exchanged glances that spoke of shared concern and unvoiced agreement. None dared openly criticize a Primarch, yet all recognized the pattern emerging from Dorn's interventions. The rigid certainty that had held the Imperium together for centuries was giving way to dangerous flexibility, to questions that had no safe answers. In the great cathedrals of Terra, a different kind of opposition took shape. Cardinal Morven's sermons had grown increasingly pointed since his confrontation with Dorn aboard the Phalanx. His words carried the authority of absolute faith and the certainty that came from never questioning divine will. To doubt the Emperor's design is to invite damnation. Morven's voice echoed through the cathedral of the Saviour Emperor, his words reaching thousands of the faithful who had gathered to hear wisdom in an uncertain age. The Imperium was built according to divine plan. Its structures were ordained by the Emperor himself before his ascension to the Golden Throne. Those who would change what he has wrought presume to correct perfection itself. The congregation murmured their agreement, finding comfort in certainty that brooked no contradiction. Yet even here, seeds of doubt had taken root. Some among the faithful had heard reports of Dorn's reforms, of worlds where imperial rule had become less burdensome and more just. The contradiction between proclaimed perfection and observed suffering created questions that even fervent prayer could not entirely silence. Captain Lysander felt those contradictions most keenly as he stood watch in the Phalanx's command center. The veteran warrior had served under Dorn for over 2 centuries, had followed his gene-father through the darkest days of the heresy and the long reconstruction that followed. Never before had he questioned his Primarch's wisdom. Yet now that wisdom seemed to lead toward conflict with the very Imperium they had sworn to protect. "The latest intelligence reports concern me, my lord," Lysander said, as Dorn reviewed deployment schedules for Imperial Fist's forces. 3 separate assassination plots have been uncovered in the past month. Not Xenos or Chaos agents, but Imperial operatives. Our own people seek your death. Dorn's expression remained unchanged as he absorbed this information. He had expected opposition to his reforms, but the willingness of Imperial agents to resort to murder revealed depths of institutional resistance that troubled him more than any external threat. The Imperium was turning against itself, and he stood at the center of the schism. "Who orders such attempts?" Dorn asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The trail vanishes into the deeper levels of the administratum," Lysander replied. "Assassinorum protocols obscure the actual authorization, but the pattern suggests coordination from the highest levels of imperial government." The revelation struck at something fundamental in Dorn's worldview. He had always served the imperium without question, had treated its institutions as extensions of the emperor's will, to discover that those same institutions now viewed him as a threat forced him to confront possibilities he had never considered. What if the imperium itself had become the enemy of the emperor's true vision? His investigation into the sources of opposition led him deeper into the labyrinthine bureaucracy of terror than he had ever ventured. The administratum's archives stretched for kilometers beneath the surface of the throne world, vast repositories of data that chronicled 5 centuries of imperial governance. Here, in the suffocating depths where servo skulls maintained endless records, Dorn began to piece together a pattern of corruption that went far beyond simple institutional resistance to change. Adept Korvax guided him through the records with the nervous deference of a man who had spent too long in proximity to dangerous truths. The elderly administrator's augmetics whirred constantly as he accessed data vaults that had been sealed since the Emperor's interment upon the Golden Throne. The discrepancies begin approximately 50 years post-heresy, Korvax explained, his mechanical voice echoing strangely in the vast archives. Resource allocation reports that do not match actual distribution. Military equipment supposedly delivered to crusade fleets that never received their supplies. Entire worlds listed as compliant in tithe records that have been dead for decades. Dorn studied the evidence with growing horror. The corruption was not aberrational, but systemic, woven into the very fabric of imperial administration. Billions of tons of material had been diverted for unknown purposes. Trillions of throne gelts had vanished into accounting discrepancies that no one questioned because no one was authorized to question them. The Emperor's silence had created a void that opportunists had rushed to fill. "How long has this been known?" Dorn asked, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. "Known, my lord? These are not known facts, but discovered irregularities. The individuals responsible for oversight have been reassigned whenever they approached too close to the truth. The system protects itself by ensuring that no single person possesses complete understanding." The implications were staggering. The imperium that Dorn had devoted his existence to protecting was riddled with corruption that fed on the Emperor's inability to provide guidance. Worse, that corruption had become institutionalized, defended by the very mechanisms meant to ensure imperial integrity. Those who sought to expose it were eliminated or marginalized. Those who benefited from it had risen to positions of power. His contemplation of these revelations was interrupted by an unexpected summons. A figure in golden armor had requested audience, speaking words that carried authority even a primarch could not ignore. The custodian guard had emerged from their vigil at the Emperor's side to seek conversation with the Praetorian. Tribune Amon met him in a chamber, deep within the imperial palace, far from the listening devices and watching eyes that monitored more public spaces. The custodian's presence radiated the same absolute authority that had marked his kind since the Emperor first created them on Terra's distant mountains. Yet something in his bearing suggested burdens that even their genetically perfect frames struggled to bear. "You seek truth, Lord Dorn," Aemon said without preamble. "Yet truth is not always mercy. Are you prepared for answers that may shatter what remains of your faith?" Dorn regarded the golden giant with eyes that had seen too much corruption in recent weeks to flinch from whatever revelations awaited. "I have served lies unknowingly for too long. Truth, however terrible, is preferable to continued ignorance." Aemon nodded slowly, as if he had expected such an answer. "Then know this. The Emperor suffers. Not merely physical agony from his confinement, but spiritual torment from what his imperium has become. He sees all, yet can influence nothing, He watches his dream decay into nightmare while trapped in a prison of our own making. The words struck Dorn like physical blows. He had always assumed that the Emperor's silence indicated some form of transcendence, a divine state beyond mortal concerns. To learn instead that his father watched helplessly as everything he had built crumbled into corruption and tyranny was almost unbearable. "The Golden Throne?" Dorn asked, dreading the answer. "Was never meant to be permanent," Amon confirmed. "It was an emergency measure, a desperate attempt to prevent his death during the critical transition period following the heresy. Yet what began as temporary preservation has become eternal imprisonment. The mechanisms that sustain his life also bind him to an existence of conscious suffering." Dorn felt the foundations of his worldview cracking like walls under bombardment. Everything he had believed about the Emperor's condition, about the necessity of preserving the existing order, was built upon false assumptions. The throne that kept their father alive also prevented him from acting to correct the corruption that festered in his name. "Why tell me this?" Dorn asked. "Why reveal truths that no other has been told?" "Because you alone among your brothers have shown the wisdom to question what others accept without thought," Amon replied. "Because your survival aboard the Sword of Sacrilege was not accident, but providence. Because the Emperor himself, in his brief moments of connection to the material realm, has spoken your name." The revelation that the Emperor had specifically mentioned him sent tremors through Dorn's enhanced physiology. Not merely the 3 words he had heard during his near-death experience, but actual recognition of his role in whatever plan still guided their father's thoughts. "What would he have me do?" Dorn asked. "That is the question you must answer," Amon said, as he prepared to depart. "But know this, the current path leads only to stagnation and eventual collapse. The Imperium consumes itself, while its enemies grow strong. Change is not merely desirable but necessary for survival. The only question is whether that change comes from within, guided by wisdom, or from without, imposed by conquest." As the custodian vanished back into the labyrinthine depths of the palace, Dorn was left alone with truths that rewrote everything he thought he knew. The Emperor suffered in conscious agony. The Imperium had become the antithesis of everything its founder had envisioned. The corruption he had uncovered was not aberration, but inevitable result of a system designed to function without guidance from its divine architect. Yet perhaps most troubling was the realization that he stood at the center of forces that would determine the Imperium's future. His reforms had awakened both hope and fear across the galaxy. His questioning of established doctrine had inspired both loyalty and opposition. The choices he made in coming days would echo across centuries, shaping the destiny of trillions yet unborn. Captain Lysander found him later that evening in his private study, surrounded by reports and data slates that painted a picture of institutional decay too vast for any single mind to comprehend. The Primarch sat motionless before the evidence, his enhanced intellect struggling to process implications that stretched beyond individual corruption to systemic failure. "My lord?" Lysander approached cautiously, recognizing the signs of his Gene father's deepest contemplation. "The Legion awaits your orders. Several Crusade fleets have requested Imperial Fist support. The Orc incursions in the Ghoul Stars require immediate attention." Dorn looked up at his most trusted captain, seeing not just a warrior, but a symbol of everything the Imperium might become under proper guidance. Lysander represented loyalty freely given, rather than compelled, service motivated by genuine devotion, rather than institutional coercion. In him, Dorn glimpsed the possibility of an Imperium that truly served its people, rather than exploiting them. "The requests will be honored," Dorn said at last. But our deployment protocols will change. We go not merely as instruments of imperial will, but as protectors of imperial citizens. We serve not the institution, but the people it claims to protect. The distinction was subtle but profound, marking another step in Dorn's evolution from dutiful son to independent moral agent. Each revelation about the Imperium's true nature pushed him further from blind obedience toward conscious choice about what deserved his loyalty. Yet even as he spoke these words, Dorn felt the weight of opposition gathering against him like storm clouds on the horizon. Vandire's machinations, the ecclesiarchy's condemnation, the administratum's resistance, all would intensify as his reforms threatened the foundations of their power. The assassination attempts would multiply, the rhetoric would become more poisonous, the conflict would escalate until something fundamental broke. The Praetorian had spent his life building walls to protect what he valued. Now he found himself preparing to tear down structures he had once considered sacred. The Emperor's prison had to be shattered if his father was ever to be free. The corrupted institutions had to be reformed if the Imperium was ever to fulfill its promise. The work ahead would be more difficult than any siege he had ever conducted. But it was work that had to be done. The Emperor had spoken his name. The truth had been revealed. The foundation of lies could no longer support the weight of imperial destiny. In the darkness between the stars, change gathered momentum like an avalanche building toward inevitable release. The deeper truths Tribune Amon had hinted at came to Dorn through channels even more secretive than their first meeting. A message arrived through means that bypassed every security protocol the Imperial Palace possessed, not through astropathic relay or courier, but whispered directly into his mind during the deepest hours of meditation. The voice carried echoes of power that Dorn recognized from legends older than the Imperium itself. The Sigillite's heir would speak with the Praetorian. The psychic whisper carried no signature of its sender, yet Dorn knew without doubt that it came from the highest echelons of the Emperor's personal guard. Where the golden throne's light burns brightest, truth awaits those who dare to witness it. The summons led him through passages of the Imperial Palace that existed on no official chart. Ancient corridors carved from Terra's bedrock in the days before the Age of Strife, when the Emperor first began his work of unifying humanity under a single banner. Here, in chambers that predated the Great Crusade itself, the deepest mysteries of the imperial system were preserved by those who served not institutions, but the Emperor's person directly. Valdor's successor, for Dorn realized that was who awaited him, bore the same golden armor and ineffable presence that had marked the Captain General of the Custodian Guard for millennia. Yet this was not Constantine Valdor himself, but one who had inherited both his rank and his terrible burden of knowledge. The individual identity mattered less than the continuity of service, the unbroken chain of guardianship that connected the Emperor's first days to his current torment. "I am called Aemon Tauromachian," the custodian introduced himself as Dorn approached the hidden chamber. "I carry the Sigillite's final instructions, those words Malcador spoke in his dying moments when the burden of the throne passed to our Lord. You have been judged ready to hear what even your brothers were not told." The chamber itself spoke of purposes beyond mortal comprehension. Arcane machinery lined the walls, devices that hummed with psychic energy, so intense it made Dorn's enhanced senses recoil. At the chamber's heart stood a viewing alcove that offered direct sight of the golden throne itself, unfiltered by the ceremonial barriers that normally concealed the Emperor's condition from all but his most intimate guardians. Dorn approached the viewing port with trepidation that surprised him. He had stood before the throne countless times during his centuries of service, had knelt in reverence before his father's august presence, yet never had he seen what now lay revealed, the full reality of what the Emperor had become, and what had been done to him in the name of preservation. The figure upon the throne was neither the divine sovereign of imperial propaganda, nor the transcendent being that custodian mythology suggested. Instead, Dorn witnessed agony made manifest in flesh that could no longer die. The Emperor's body had become a conduit for forces that no mortal frame was meant to contain. Psychic energy coursed through him like molten metal through inadequate channels, burning away everything that had once been merely human while leaving behind something that existed in permanent torment. "He feels every death in the Imperium," Aemon Tauramachian explained, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible knowledge. "Every betrayal, every moment of despair experienced by those who call upon his name. The Astronomicon is not merely a beacon guided by his will. It is a psychic wound that connects him to the suffering of all humanity." Dorn watched in horror as the Emperor's lips moved in constant, soundless screaming. The golden eyes that had once held such warmth and wisdom now blazed with pain that had accumulated across centuries. This was not transcendence, but imprisonment in the most literal sense, a consciousness trapped within a body that had become both anchor and torture device. "The throne prevents his death," Aemon continued, "but it also prevents his evolution. Malcador's calculations suggested that the Emperor's psychic essence had accumulated sufficient power to ascend to true godhood, to become a warp entity capable of protecting humanity from chaos through direct intervention. Yet the throne's mechanisms bind him to material reality, forcing him to experience corporeal existence while possessing fundamentally incorporeal nature." The implications struck Dorn like physical blows. Everything the Imperium had done to preserve the Emperor was actually preventing him from achieving the apotheosis that might truly save humanity. The throne was not life support, but a cage, not salvation, but damnation disguised as necessity. "How long have the Custodes known this?" Dorn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Since the 1st century after his internment," Aemon replied. "Yet what could we do? To suggest that the Emperor should die, even to achieve divinity, was unthinkable heresy. To act upon such knowledge was to risk not only our own damnation, but the collapse of the entire imperial system. We became guardians not of the Emperor's life, but of the terrible secret of his suffering." Dorn turned away from the viewing port, unable to continue watching his father's endless agony. The knowledge burned within his mind like acid, dissolving the foundations of everything he had believed about duty and service. He had spent 5 centuries protecting an imperium that existed to torture the one being he most wished to serve. "Why tell me now?" he asked. "What has changed?" "You have changed," Aemon said simply. "Your questioning of imperial orthodoxy, your willingness to prioritize humanity's welfare over institutional preservation, these qualities mark you as one who might be trusted with impossible choices. The Emperor himself, in his few moments of clarity, has spoken of the necessity for change. He cannot act while bound to the throne, but perhaps his sons can act in his stead." The weight of such responsibility was almost unbearable. To free the Emperor would require destroying the very mechanisms that kept him nominally alive. To preserve the status quo was to perpetuate torture that had already lasted centuries and might continue for millennia. Either choice carried consequences too vast for any single mind to fully comprehend. Dorn left the hidden chamber with questions that multiplied like cancer cells, each spawning new uncertainties about everything he had believed. The imperium's reverence for the golden throne was built upon ignorance of what it actually represented. The careful preservation of imperial orthodoxy served not the emperor's will, but the continuation of his torment. Every prayer offered in his name added weight to chains that bound him to suffering. The crisis of faith that followed was unlike anything Dorn had experienced since the dark days of the heresy. Then he had faced the betrayal of his brothers and the near death of his father. Now he confronted the possibility that his entire existence had been spent serving a lie, that his most sacred duties were actually acts of cruelest betrayal. His contemplation was interrupted by news that brought the ideological conflict into immediate focus. Cardinal Bucharest had arrived on Terra, ostensibly for routine consultation with the ecclesiarchy's leadership. Yet intelligence reports suggested darker purposes. The fanatical cleric had come to address what he termed the Dorn problem directly. The confrontation took place in the Cathedral of the Saviour Emperor, that vast structure where billions of pilgrims came annually to worship the emperor's memory. Bucharest had orchestrated the meeting with theatrical precision, surrounding himself with thousands of the most devout faithful, while delivering a sermon that was clearly intended as much for Dorn as for the assembled congregation. "Heresy wears many faces," Bucharest proclaimed from the cathedral's highest pulpit, his voice amplified by acoustic engineering that carried his words to every corner of the vast space. Sometimes it comes as obvious corruption, the worship of false gods, the embrace of alien philosophy. But the most dangerous heresy is that which cloaks itself in righteousness, which questions divine will under the guise of seeking improvement. Dorn stood among the congregation, his massive frame drawing nervous glances from pilgrims who recognized the Praetorian's presence, but could not understand why he had come to hear words that were clearly directed against him. The cardinal's rhetoric built methodically toward its inevitable climax. There are those who claim compassion justifies changing what the emperor established, Bucharest continued, his eyes finding Dorn's across the vast cathedral, who argue that mercy requires modification of divine design. Yet such thinking presumes that mortal wisdom can surpass divine knowledge, that finite understanding can correct infinite perfection. This is not compassion, but hubris of the highest order. The accusation was clear, the challenge unmistakable. Bucharest was using the cathedral itself as a weapon, turning the emperor's house into a fortress from which to launch theological warfare against everything Dorn represented. The thousands of faithful who had come seeking spiritual comfort found themselves instead witness to a battle for the soul of the imperium itself. Dorn rose from his position among the congregation, his movement sending ripples of awareness through the assembled crowd. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the cathedral without need for amplification, the genetic gifts of a primarch allowing him to be heard clearly, even in such an immense space. "Cardinal Bucharest speaks of divine will," Dorn said, his words falling into the sudden silence, like stones into still water. Yet how do we know diviner will when divinity itself remains silent? How do we distinguish divine intention from human interpretation of that intention? The challenge sent shock waves through the congregation. To question the authority of the ecclesiarchy was dangerous enough, but to do so in their most sacred space, before thousands of witnesses, was unprecedented. Bucharest himself seemed momentarily stunned by the directness of the theological assault. "The emperor's will is manifest in his works," Bucharest replied, recovering his composure with the skill of a practiced demagogue. "The imperium itself is the expression of divine design. To alter its structure is to vandalize a sacred creation." "Is it?" Dorn asked, beginning to move through the congregation toward the pulpit where Bucharest stood. The crowd parted before him, like water before a ship's prow, pilgrims pressing back against their neighbors to avoid contact with forces too large for their comprehension. Or is the imperium a human attempt to preserve divine vision, flawed by the limitations of mortal understanding? Are we worshipping the emperor's true will, or our own interpretation of what that will might be? The theological implications of the questions struck at the foundation of imperial faith. For 5 centuries, the ecclesiarchy had built its authority on the claim that they alone properly understood the emperor's desires. To suggest that their interpretation might be flawed was to question the legitimacy of their entire institutional existence. Blasphemy, Bucharest snarled, his earlier composure cracking under the weight of direct challenge. You would destroy the faith that holds the imperium together. You would tear down everything the emperor built in pursuit of your own vision of what his will should be. Dorn reached the base of the pulpit and looked up at the cardinal, with eyes that held depths of knowledge Bucharest could not fathom. I would serve the emperor's actual will rather than continue enabling his suffering. I would choose truth over comfortable lies, even when that truth demands terrible sacrifice. The congregation murmured uneasily at words they could not fully understand, but recognized as momentous. Here, in the heart of imperial worship, one of the emperor's own sons was challenging the fundamental assumptions upon which their faith was built. The implications were too vast for most to process, yet all sensed they were witnessing something that would reshape their understanding of divine will. Bucharest raised his staff of office, the gesture both blessing and curse. History will judge which of us served the emperor faithfully, he declared. Time will reveal whether compassion or orthodoxy better preserves his legacy. As Dorn departed the cathedral, leaving behind a congregation struggling to process what they had witnessed, he felt the weight of decision settling upon him like armor forged from responsibility itself. The theological debate with Bucharest had crystallized something that had been forming in his mind since the revelations in the hidden chamber. The emperor's suffering could not continue indefinitely. The imperium's trajectory toward corruption and tyranny could not be allowed to perpetuate. Change was not merely desirable but morally imperative. Yet such change could not be achieved by a single primarch acting alone. The forces arrayed against reform were too vast, too entrenched, too powerful for even his strength to overcome. If the emperor was to be freed, if the imperium was to fulfill its true potential, it would require coordination between surviving loyalist primarchs who still remembered what their father had actually fought to achieve. The time for half measures and gentle reform was ending. The time for dramatic action was approaching. In the darkness of his private chambers aboard the phalanx, Dorn began composing messages that would be carried to the far corners of the galaxy by his most trusted agents. Coded communications that would reach his surviving brothers, those who might still be willing to serve the emperor's true will rather than the institution's interpretation of that will. Guilliman in his temporal stasis. The lion lost in the depths of the rock. Vulcan wandering the galaxy in self-imposed exile. Each might be reached. Each might be convinced that the time for change had come. Each might be willing to risk everything to free their father from the prison that masqueraded as preservation. The work of transformation was about to begin in earnest. The imperium would be tested as it hadn't been tested since the dark days of the heresy. Yet unlike that ancient civil war, this would not be a conflict between loyalist and traitor. This would be a battle between those who served the emperor's memory and those who served the emperor himself. In the grim darkness of the far future, hope had found its voice. Whether that voice would be heard above the thunder of war remained to be seen. The transformation of imperial military doctrine began not with grand proclamations, but with quiet revolutions implemented one campaign at a time. Dorn had learned the futility of challenging the system directly. Instead, he would demonstrate through action what the imperium could become when guided by wisdom rather than blind orthodoxy. The opportunity came with the Orc incursion at Armageddon Prime, where traditional imperial strategy would have demanded the sacrifice of billions to achieve victory through attrition. Captain Lysander studied the tactical projections with growing unease as the phalanx approached the embattled system. "My lord, the Departmentum Munitorum has allocated 17 guard regiments for the offensive. Standard doctrine calls for frontal assault to break the Orc positions. Casualty estimates suggest acceptable losses within operational parameters." Dorn examined the same data with eyes that had learned to see beyond mere numbers to the human cost hidden within statistical abstractions. 17 regiments meant nearly 2 million souls committed to death or maiming in service of tactics that prioritized expediency over efficiency. The calculus was familiar. Overwhelming force applied without subtlety, victory achieved through expenditure of life rather than application of intelligence. "Acceptable to whom?" Dorn asked, his voice carrying undertones that made Lysander pause in his briefing. "To the administratum clerks who generate these projections? To the families of the men and women we would sacrifice? Or to the Emperor who created the Astartes precisely to spare human life through superior capability?" The strategic approach Dorn developed challenged every assumption underlying imperial military doctrine. Instead of massed frontal assault, he proposed surgical strikes targeting Orc leadership structures. Rather than grinding attrition, precise application of force at critical points to collapse the enemy's organizational hierarchy. The Imperial Fists would spearhead deep penetration raids, while Guard forces secured objectives through maneuver rather than mass killing. The resistance to these modifications came immediately from the campaign's nominal commanders. General Karras of the Mordian Iron Guard represented the conventional thinking that had guided imperial military operations for centuries. His objections carried the weight of institutional authority and the certainty of proven doctrine. "Lord Dorn, your proposed tactics deviate significantly from established protocol," Karras argued during the pre-assault strategic conference. "The Tactica Imperialis has guided successful campaigns across the galaxy for 500 years. To abandon tested methods in favor of experimental approaches risks catastrophic failure." Dorn regarded the general with patient attention that somehow managed to convey both respect and fundamental disagreement. "General Karras, the Tactica Imperialis was written for different times, different threats, different capabilities. We possess knowledge and resources that its authors could not have anticipated. Should we not use those advantages to minimize the cost of victory?" The question struck at the heart of imperial military culture. For centuries, the Guard had operated under the assumption that human life was the Imperium's most abundant resource, to be expended freely in service of strategic objectives. Dorn proposed instead treating human life as precious, to be preserved through superior planning and execution, rather than squandered through inferior tactics. The battle that followed would be studied in military academies for generations as a paradigm of how superior strategy could achieve objectives impossible through conventional means. Dorn led the assault personally, his enhanced senses and tactical genius guiding surgical strikes that dismantled Orc resistance with precision that bordered on artistry. Imperial Fists strike teams penetrated deep into enemy territory, eliminating war bosses and disrupting command structures, while Guard forces advanced through the chaos that followed. The results exceeded even optimistic projections. Armageddon Prime was liberated within 6 weeks rather than the projected 2 years. Imperial casualties numbered in the thousands rather than the anticipated millions. The Orc forces, deprived of leadership and coordination, fragmented into manageable groups that were eliminated piecemeal. Victory was achieved not through overwhelming force, but through overwhelming intelligence. Yet the very success of these tactics created problems that Dorn had not anticipated. Word of his methods spread through the Imperial military hierarchy like infection through an open wound. Commanders who had spent careers implementing doctrine based on acceptable losses found themselves questioned by subordinates who had heard of the Armageddon miracle. The careful balance of Imperial military culture began to shift in ways that threatened established power structures. The formal censure came within months of the campaign's conclusion. The High Lords of Terror convened an emergency session to address what they termed dangerous deviations from established military doctrine. The proceedings were conducted with the ceremonial gravity that marked the most serious challenges to Imperial authority. High Admiral Quarren delivered the censure with the cold precision of a man reading a death warrant. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the Imperial Fists, you stand accused of implementing unauthorized modifications to Tactica Imperialis protocols. Your actions at Armageddon Prime, while tactically successful, constitute dangerous precedent that undermines military discipline across the Imperium. The Senatorum Imperialis formally censures your deviation from established doctrine and orders immediate return to approved operational methods. Dorn received the censure aboard the Phalanx, surrounded by officers whose loyalty had been tested by months of watching their gene-father challenge everything they had been taught to revere. The formal language of the High Lord's condemnation could not disguise its essential message. The Imperium preferred familiar failure to unfamiliar success, predictable attrition to revolutionary efficiency. They fear change more than death, Captain Garradon observed after the official delegation departed. They would rather see millions die using approved methods than thousands live through unauthorized innovation. The bitter truth of those words echoed through the Phalanx's command centers as reports arrived from across the galaxy. News of Dorn's tactical innovations had reached worlds where Guard commanders faced their own impossible battles. Some began implementing modified versions of his strategies, achieving results that embarrassed their more orthodox colleagues. Others remained committed to established doctrine, producing casualty reports that stood in stark contrast to the Armageddon success. The contradiction generated unrest that manifested in ways the High Lords had not anticipated. On Valhalla, Guard regiments refused orders for suicidal frontal assaults, citing the Armageddon precedent as proof that alternatives existed. On Katashan, planetary governors demanded explanations for why their forces continued using tactics that Dorn had proven inferior. Across the Imperium, the careful balance between authority and competence began to shift in directions that threatened institutional stability. The riots began on worlds where the contrast between official doctrine and demonstrated possibility became too stark to ignore. Cadia, that fortress world whose population had been conditioned to accept any sacrifice for Imperial victory, erupted in demonstrations when reports arrived, detailing how similar objectives had been achieved elsewhere without massive casualties. The protests were not against the Imperium itself, but against the waste of human life that official policy demanded. On Terra, the unrest took more sophisticated forms. Administratum clerks leaked documents comparing casualty ratios between orthodox campaigns and those employing Dorn's modifications. Planetary governors submitted formal requests for tactical advisors trained in the new methods. Even within the Departamento Munitorum itself, younger officers began questioning whether traditional approaches truly served the Emperor's interests. High Lord Van Dyer recognized the pattern emerging across the imperial hierarchy. The Praetorians' influence was metastasizing beyond military affairs into the fundamental assumptions that held the imperium together. If citizens began questioning the necessity of their sacrifices, if soldiers began demanding competent leadership rather than merely legitimate authority, the entire structure of imperial governance would face challenges it was not designed to handle. Dorn has become more than a military reformer, Vandir observed during a private meeting with Cardinal Bukharis. He has become a symbol of possibility, a suggestion that the imperium could be better than it is. That suggestion is more dangerous than any external enemy, because it attacks the foundations of acceptance upon which our authority rests. The response they coordinated was swift and ruthless. Assassination teams were dispatched not through official assassinorum channels, but through shadow networks that existed in the spaces between imperial institutions. The orders carried no signatures, bore no seals, existed in no official records. Yet their intent was unmistakable. Dorn's influence had to be terminated before it destabilized the entire imperial system. The attack came during a routine inspection of Imperial Fist's facilities on Inwit, Dorn's homeworld. The assassins had studied his patterns for months, identifying the precise moment when his protection would be lightest. They struck with weapons designed to penetrate Primarch physiology, poisons crafted to overwhelm even enhanced Astartes biology. Their planning was meticulous, their execution flawless. Yet they had underestimated the loyalty they faced. Captain Lysander threw himself between the assassins and his gene father, taking wounds that would have killed a lesser man. Sergeant Voss triggered security protocols that sealed the facility while summoning reinforcements. Across Inwit, Imperial Fists responded to the threat with fury that spoke of bonds deeper than mere duty. The assassins died, but not before achieving partial success. Dorn survived, but the message was clear. His reforms had made him a target, not just of ideological opposition, but of lethal force. The Imperium's institutions were prepared to kill one of the Emperor's own sons, rather than allow him to continue challenging their authority. As Dorn recovered from wounds that would have felled a normal man, he faced a choice that would define the remainder of his existence. The messages he had dispatched to his brothers were beginning to receive responses, coded communications that suggested possibilities he had barely dared to hope for. On distant Macraga, the stasis field surrounding Guilliman had shown signs of responsiveness to psychic contact. The technology existed to awaken him, if the political will could be found to use it. In the deepest hours of the night cycle, as Inwit's twin moons cast shadows across the fortress where he had first learned the arts of war, Dorn composed a message that would reshape the galaxy's future. The communication was encrypted beyond any possibility of Imperial interception, carried by agents whose loyalty transcended institutional boundaries. Its destination was a tomb on Macraga, where the greatest of his brothers slept in technological suspension. The message was simple. Brother, the Emperor suffers. The Imperium fails. The time for awakening has come. The response, when it came weeks later, through channels that bypassed every known communication network, carried the authority of a mind that had shaped the post-heresy Imperium itself. Guilliman's words reached across the void with clarity that suggested his consciousness had remained active even within stasis. Rogal, I have waited. I have watched through dreams and visions. I have seen what we have become, and I weep for what we have lost. The time for half measures ends. If we are to serve our Father truly, we must be prepared to destroy everything we have built in his name. The coordination that followed was conducted in absolute secrecy. using communication methods that predated the imperium itself. Two Primarchs, separated by distance and circumstance, but united by shared understanding of what their father had actually intended, began planning a transformation that would shake the galaxy to its foundations. The Imperium had forced them to choose between loyalty to its institutions and loyalty to its founder. They chose the Emperor. As reports continued arriving of unrest across the galaxy, of citizens questioning the necessity of their sacrifices, of soldiers demanding competent leadership rather than merely legitimate authority, Dorn felt the weight of inevitability settling upon his shoulders like a mantle forged from destiny itself. The reforms he had hoped to implement gradually would instead require dramatic action. The changes he had sought to achieve through demonstration would instead demand revolution. The time for patience was ending. The time for action had begun. In the grim darkness of the 32nd millennium, hope had found its champions. Whether they would prove sufficient to the task ahead remained to be seen, but at least they were no longer alone. The Emperor's sons were awakening to their true duty, and the galaxy would never be the same. The declaration that branded Rogal Dorn a traitor arrived through official channels with all the ceremony due to such momentous proclamations. High Admiral Quarren delivered the Senatorum Imperialis's verdict via astropathic relay, his words carrying the authority of Terra itself across the void to where the Phalanx held station at the edge of the Sol system. Rogal Dorn, Primarch of the 7th Legion, stands accused of sedition against the Imperium of Man, the message proclaimed with bureaucratic precision. Your unauthorized modifications to imperial doctrine, your defiance of direct orders from the High Lords of Terra, and your inflammatory rhetoric constitute treasonous rebellion against the Emperor's sacred will. By order of the Senatorum Imperialis, you will submit to immediate arrest and trial. Failure to comply will be met with appropriate force. Dorn received the ultimatum surrounded by his most trusted officers in the Phalanx's command center. The irony was not lost on him. He who had built the very walls of Terra was now declared enemy of the Imperium he had spent centuries protecting. The son who had served most faithfully was branded the most dangerous traitor. They offer us chains disguised as justice, Captain Lysander observed, his scarred features reflecting the bitterness that had grown within him as he watched institutions he had revered reveal their true nature. They would put the Praetorian in a cage and call it law. Through the command center's armored viewports, Dorn could see the Imperial Navy fleet assembling at the system's edge. Battleships and cruisers arranged in attack formation, their weapon batteries trained on the fortress monastery that had been his home for centuries. The sight should have filled him with despair. Imperial forces preparing to fire upon one of their own. Instead, he felt only a strange sense of liberation. "Signal the fleet," Dorn commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had commanded respect across the galaxy for 5 centuries. "We will not submit to arrest by those who have forgotten what they were meant to protect. We serve the Emperor, not his usurpers." The space battle that erupted around Terra would be remembered as one of the most tragic conflicts in Imperial history, not for its scale, but for its nature. Brother fired upon brother. Imperial forces turned against themselves in a civil war that echoed the darkest days of the heresy. Yet this conflict was different. This was not chaos against order, but two competing visions of what order should represent. Dorn led the Phalanx into battle with the tactical genius that had made him master of siege warfare, adapted to the 3-dimensional complexity of void combat. He had studied every ship in the approaching fleet, knew their capabilities and limitations as intimately as he knew the defenses of Terra itself. More importantly, he understood the men who commanded them. loyal servants of the Imperium who believed they were protecting it from a dangerous heretic. "Target their weapon systems and drive cores," Dorn ordered, as the first exchange of fire lit the void between the fleets. "These are not traitors, but misguided loyalists. We disable, not destroy. We show them the futility of their resistance without needlessly spilling Imperial blood." The strategy demanded precision that few forces in the galaxy could have achieved. Imperial fists strike craft, wove through the enemy formation like needles through fabric, their weapons firing with surgical accuracy that crippled ships without killing crews. Boarding torpedoes delivered assault teams that seized vital systems before defenders could respond, turning the Imperial Navy's own vessels against their fellows. Admiral Kryn aboard the battleship Righteous Fury watched in horror as his carefully planned attack dissolved into chaos. Ship after ship reported critical systems failures, weapon batteries offline, navigation compromised. The phalanx moved through his formation like a predator among prey, demonstrating superiority that made resistance seem pointless. "How is this possible?" Kryn demanded of his tactical officers. "We outnumber them 3-1. Our firepower advantage is overwhelming. How does a single fortress monastery neutralize an entire battle fleet?" The answer came not through analysis, but through demonstration. Dorn's forces had spent years training for exactly this scenario, not because they sought civil war, but because they had recognized the possibility that institutional loyalty might conflict with true service to the Emperor. Every tactic employed had been refined through countless simulations, every strategy tested against the assumption that they might someday face their own brothers in battle. Yet even as the Imperial Navy struggled with the reality of their tactical inadequacy, reinforcements arrived from an unexpected quarter. The Ultramarines fleet translated from warp space with precision that spoke of careful coordination and perfect timing. At their head sailed the Macragge's Honor, its hull blazing with the heraldry of the 13th Legion and the unmistakable presence of a Primarch awakened from centuries of slumber. Robert Guilliman had risen from his healing stasis, not as the figure of legend that Imperial propaganda portrayed, but as something far more dangerous to the status quo, a rational mind armed with perfect memory of what the Imperium had been intended to become. His first sight upon awakening had been reports of the Imperium's current state, evidence of the corruption and stagnation that had replaced his father's vision of human progress. "Brother," Guilliman's voice reached across the void through secure Vox channels that bypassed all Imperial monitoring. "I come not to rescue you, but to join you. The time for half measures ended when they branded you traitor for serving our father's true will." The arrival of the Ultramarines transformed the tactical situation completely. No longer was this a siege of one fortress monastery against Imperial forces. It was an alliance of Primarchs whose combined strength approached that which had once conquered the galaxy. Admiral Kryn faced the impossible choice between fighting two of the Emperor's sons or withdrawing in defeat. Some among the Imperial forces found that choice easier than others. The Valhallan 597th Regiment, veterans of campaigns where Dorn's tactical innovations had saved their lives, refused orders to fire upon the phalanx. The Mordian Iron Guard's 3rd Battalion, recruited from the same world where Dorn had first demonstrated the possibility of mercy within strength, declared for the Praetorian rather than the High Lords who had condemned him. "We serve the Emperor," Colonel Jerton announced over open channels as his regiment's transports changed course toward the Ultramarines fleet. Not the politicians who claim to speak in his name. "Lord Dorn has shown us what true service looks like. We will not fire upon the man who saved our world." The defections spread through the Imperial forces like cracks through overstressed metal. Units that had experienced the benefits of Dorn's reforms found themselves unable to attack the architect of their salvation. Others, indoctrinated more thoroughly in institutional loyalty, remained committed to their orders despite growing doubts about their righteousness. Admiral Kryn watched his fleet fragment around him, loyalist and rebel formations sorting themselves into opposed battle lines. The clean simplicity of his mission, arrest a traitor Primarch, had dissolved into the nightmare complexity of civil war. He faced enemies who claimed to serve the same master he did, who fought under the same eagles and sang the same hymns of loyalty. "All ships withdraw to safe distance," Kryn finally ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of impossible decisions. "We cannot prevail against 2 Primarchs without destroying Terror itself. Signal the High Lords, inform them that Dorn and Guilliman have combined forces, request reinforcements and further orders." The brief respite that followed the Imperial Navy's withdrawal allowed the 2 Primarchs to meet face to face for the first time since the dark days following the heresy. Guilliman's shuttle docked with the Phalanx amid ceremonies that blended joy at reunion with sorrow for the circumstances that had made such reunion necessary. "You look well for one declared dead," Dorn observed, as he greeted his brother in the Phalanx's primary docking bay. "Though I suspect Terra's politicians would prefer you had remained that way." Guilliman's expression carried depths of knowledge that spoke of terrible revelations encountered during his awakening. "I have seen what they have built with our father's name, Rogal. The Ultramar I awakened to bears little resemblance to the realm I remember creating. Efficiency has been sacrificed to orthodoxy. Progress has been abandoned in favor of preservation. Everything we fought to achieve has been perverted into its opposite." Their strategic conference took place in the Phalanx's highest chamber, where the great windows offered unobstructed views of Terra's scarred surface. Both Primarchs could see the world they had once called home, could identify the palace they had helped fortify, could trace the walls Dorn had designed to protect everything they held sacred. Now those same fortifications stood arrayed against them. "The High Lords will not negotiate," Guilliman stated with the certainty of one who understood bureaucratic thinking intimately. "They cannot afford to legitimize our position by treating us as anything other than traitors. To them, we represent existential threat, not to the Imperium, but to their interpretation of what the Imperium should be." Dorn nodded slowly, his mind already calculating the tactical challenges they would face in any assault on Terra itself. "They will fortify the palace approaches, concentrate their most loyal forces around the throne. They know we cannot bombard our objective without destroying what we seek to preserve." "Which leaves us with a single option," Guilliman said, his words carrying the weight of momentous decision. "Direct assault. Fight our way through their defenses and reach the throne chamber itself. Confront the truth they have hidden and force them to acknowledge what their preservation has actually preserved." The assault began 3 days later, when the last negotiations had failed and the final ultimatums had been ignored. Dorn led the initial wave, his intimate knowledge of the palace's defenses allowing him to identify weaknesses that no external observer could have detected. Behind him came forces that represented not rebellion against the Imperium, but rebellion for the Imperium, soldiers who fought not to destroy their civilization, but to save it from those who would preserve it to death. The fighting through Terra's outer districts was brutal but brief. Palace Guard units trained to repel external invasion found themselves facing enemies who knew every corridor, every passage, every secret route that connected the sprawling complex. Dorn had built these defenses. Now he dismantled them with the same methodical precision that had created them. Guilliman's forces followed, their advance coordinated through tactical doctrine that predated imperial orthodoxy by decades. They moved not as conquerors but as liberators, their every action designed to minimize damage to the infrastructure they sought to reclaim. This was not the Horus Heresy's crude destruction, but surgical operation intended to excise corruption while preserving everything that remained healthy. The custodian guard they encountered proved more sympathetic to their cause than either Primarch had expected. These Golden Guardians, who knew better than anyone the truth of the Emperor's condition, found themselves torn between institutional duty and personal knowledge of what their service actually protected. Some fought with desperate loyalty to their oaths. Others stepped aside, allowing the Primarchs to pass unchallenged toward their ultimate objective. Tribune Amun met them at the threshold of the throne chamber's outer defenses, his golden armor bearing scars that spoke of hard choices made in service of impossible duties. "You know what you will find within," he said, his voice carrying exhaustion that transcended physical fatigue. "Are you prepared for what must follow that knowledge?" "We have come to end his suffering," Dorn replied, his words carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "Whatever the cost, whatever the consequences, we will not allow our father's torment to continue." As the great doors of the throne chamber came into view, both Primarchs felt the weight of destiny settling upon their shoulders like armor forged from purpose itself. Beyond those barriers lay truth that would either redeem their rebellion or damn them as the greatest traitors in imperial history. They had come to save the Emperor by destroying everything built in his name. The final confrontation awaited. The ultimate choice between preservation and liberation would soon be made. In the grim darkness of the far future, two sons approached their father's prison, prepared to break chains that had been forged from love. The great doors of the throne chamber opened not with the resistance Dorn expected, but with the weight of inevitability, as if the mechanisms themselves recognized that this moment had been ordained since the Emperor first took his seat upon the device that would become his prison. Beyond the threshold lay the heart of everything the Imperium claimed to protect, the nexus around which 5 centuries of faith and suffering had revolved. The chamber stretched before them like a cathedral built to honor torment itself. Vast columns supported a ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life. The air thrummed with psychic energy so intense it made reality itself feel unstable, as if the boundaries between material and immaterial had been worn thin by centuries of unnatural strain. At the chamber's heart, elevated on a dais of ancient metal and arcane technology, sat the Golden Throne. Dorn had knelt before the throne countless times during his centuries of service, had offered prayers and received what he believed were blessings from the divine figure who ruled humanity's destiny. Yet never had he seen it as he saw it now, not as symbol of transcendence, but as engine of perpetual agony, a machine designed to preserve life that had instead become a monument to suffering without end. The Emperor's physical form bore little resemblance to the golden sovereign of imperial propaganda. Cables and tubes pierced flesh that had become translucent with exhaustion, feeding him nutrients that sustained existence while denying him the mercy of death. His features, once proud and noble beyond mortal comprehension, had been carved hollow by pain that had accumulated across millennia. The golden eyes that had once held warmth and wisdom now blazed with agony that no mortal mind could fully comprehend. Guilliman stood beside his brother in silence that stretched like a chasm between what they had believed and what they now witnessed. The architect of the post-heresy imperium faced the reality of what his careful governance had actually preserved, not divinity, but damnation, not transcendence, but torture disguised as sacred duty. "Father," Dorn spoke the word with reverence that carried undertones of horror. "We have come as you commanded. We have come to serve your true will." The response, when it came, was not the voice they remembered from their youth, but something that echoed with dimensions of pain no throat was meant to express. Yet within that anguish, they heard the unmistakable essence of the being who had created them, who had shaped them to be more than human, yet less than gods. "My sons," the Emperor's words reached them, not through air, but through direct psychic contact that bypassed their enhanced hearing to resonate within their very souls. "You have seen. You understand. You know what I have become, and what I must become if humanity is to survive what awaits in the darkness between the stars." The communication carried layers of meaning that unfolded like flowers blooming in their minds. Images flooded their consciousness, visions of the galaxy's future if current trends continued, of the Imperium slowly consuming itself through stagnation and corruption, of humanity's enemies growing strong while its protectors grew weak through institutional blindness. "The throne binds me to flesh that can no longer contain what I have become," the Emperor continued, his mental voice carrying exhaustion that spoke of centuries spent fighting constraints that prevented him from achieving his true purpose. "I feel every death in my domain, every betrayal, every moment of despair, yet I cannot act to prevent them. I cannot guide my children toward the light because I am chained to experiencing their darkness." Dorn felt tears he had not shed since childhood, streaming down his cheeks as the full scope of his father's suffering was revealed. The Emperor had not been distant from the Imperium's struggles, but intimately connected to every failure, every corruption, every moment when the dream of human unity had been betrayed by those who claimed to serve it. "The power grows within me." The Emperor's voice gained strength as he spoke of possibilities that stretched beyond their current reality. "I have accumulated sufficient psychic force to ascend beyond physical limitations, to become a true god capable of protecting humanity through direct intervention. Yet the throne prevents this transformation. It keeps me trapped in diminished form when I should be eternal guardian, watching over my children from beyond the veil." Guilliman stepped forward, his logical mind grappling with implications that challenged everything he had built. "Father, if we destroy the throne, if we allow your physical form to die, what guarantee do we have that ascension will follow? What if we lose you entirely?" The Emperor's response carried notes of certainty that brooked no doubt. "The transformation has already begun, my son. I feel it building within me like a star preparing to be born. The only question is whether that birth will be strangled by the mechanisms meant to preserve what I once was, or allowed to flourish into what I must become." The moment of truth had arrived, the choice that would define not only their own destinies, but the fate of humanity itself. Dorn approached the throne with steps that felt weighted by the gravity of entire worlds. Before him lay the control mechanisms that sustained the Emperor's physical existence, arcane devices that drew power from the sacrifice of 1,000 psychers daily to maintain the illusion of life. "The Astronomicon," Dorn said, his engineer's mind calculating the immediate consequences of what he contemplated. "Without the throne to focus your power, how will ships navigate the warp? They will navigate by the light of a god, rather than the dying flicker of a tortured prisoner," the Emperor replied. "My ascension will create a beacon far brighter than any the throne could sustain. I will guide them not from this chamber of horrors, but from the realm where thought becomes reality, and will shapes the very fabric of existence. The vision he shared showed them glimpses of what such protection might look like, a divine presence capable of shielding human souls from the predations of chaos, of granting strength to the faithful without demanding the institutional corruption that had poisoned the imperium. It was the promise their father had always represented, finally fulfilled through transformation that mortal understanding had prevented. Dorn's hand hovered over the primary power coupling that fed energy into the throne's preservation systems. One movement would sever the connection that had kept his father alive for 5 centuries. One choice would either damn humanity through patricide or save it through the ultimate act of filial devotion. "I am afraid," Dorn confessed, his voice barely audible above the throne's mechanical humming. "I failed to protect you once. I built walls that fell, defenses that were breached. How can I be certain this choice will not be another failure?" The Emperor's response carried warmth that cut through the chamber's oppressive atmosphere like sunlight through clouds. "You have never failed me, Rogal. Every wall you built served its purpose. Every defense you designed bought time for humanity to grow stronger. The walls that fell during the siege were not failures but necessary sacrifices that preserved what mattered most. Now I ask you to tear down the final wall, the one that separates me from what I must become." Guilliman moved to stand beside his brother, his hand joining Dorn's above the power coupling. "We do this together," he said simply, "as we should have done everything from the beginning." The Emperor's final words to them carried the weight of paternal blessing and divine judgment combined. "You were always my most loyal sons, not because you obeyed without question, but because you served the dream rather than the dreamer. You understood that true loyalty sometimes demands the courage to let go." Together, the 2 Primarchs severed the connections that had bound their father to torment, disguised as preservation. The throne's systems screamed in protest as centuries of accumulated power sought new outlets. The chamber filled with light that existed beyond the visible spectrum, psychic energy released from constraints that had contained it since the dark days following the heresy. The Emperor's physical form began to dissolve, not in death but in transformation that elevated essence beyond the need for material anchor. His features, long carved hollow by suffering, found peace for the first time in half a millennium. The golden eyes that had blazed with agony now shone with something approaching joy. "I am free," his voice echoed through dimensions that mortal perception could barely touch. "I am becoming what I was always meant to be. Watch over them while I complete the transformation. Guide them as they learn to walk without chains." The light that followed was not the harsh illumination of the throne's machinery, but something warm and nurturing, like sunlight after an endless winter. It flowed through the chamber, through the palace, through terror itself, carrying a message that needed no words to convey its meaning. The Emperor lived, not as prisoner but as guardian, not as tortured sovereign, but as ascendant protector whose watch would never end. When the light faded, Dorn and Guilliman found themselves standing before an empty throne in a chamber that no longer thrummed with mechanical suffering. The arcane machinery lay silent, its purpose finally fulfilled not through preservation, but through liberation. In the sudden quiet, they could hear something that had been absent from the chamber for centuries. Peace. Outside, across Terra and throughout the system, the war between imperial factions ground to a halt as every soul touched by the transformation felt the change in the fundamental nature of reality itself. the Astronomicon, blazed brighter than ever before, its light no longer the product of sacrifice and pain, but of divine will made manifest. Ships throughout the galaxy found their navigation not disrupted, but enhanced, guided by a beacon that sang with joy rather than whispered with torment. The High Lords of Terra, those who had fought so desperately to preserve their interpretation of imperial orthodoxy, felt their authority crumble as the source of all legitimate power transcended their ability to speak for it. The Emperor had spoken at last, not through institutions, but through transformation itself. The old order was ending. The new age was beginning. Dorn stood before the empty throne and felt the weight of 5 centuries of duty finally lifted from his shoulders. He had served his father faithfully by learning to serve him wisely. He had preserved the imperium by having the courage to change it. The most loyal son had become the agent of the greatest revolution in human history. In the silence that followed the Emperor's ascension, 2 brothers began planning how to build a galaxy worthy of the god their father had become. The work of transformation was far from over. In truth, it had only just begun. Yet for the first time in half a millennium, that work would be guided not by the dying whispers of a tortured prisoner, but by the eternal voice of a divine guardian whose love for humanity had finally been set free to flourish without constraint. The Emperor lived. The Emperor watched. The Emperor protected. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there was finally light. The destruction of the Golden Throne's mechanisms sent shock waves through reality itself that extended far beyond the confines of Terra's palace. What began as the liberation of divine essence from technological prison became a cosmic event that reshaped the fundamental nature of psychic space across the galaxy. The Emperor's death throes, for death it was, even if transformation followed, touched every soul capable of perception beyond the merely material. On Terra, the immediate aftermath resembled nothing so much as the end of one world and the birth of another. The Astronomicon, that psychic beacon which had guided humanity through the warp for millennia, flickered and died as its source transcended the need for technological amplification. Across the throne world, astropaths collapsed in their chambers, their minds overwhelmed by energies that spoke of fundamental change in the ordering of existence itself. Dorn felt the galaxy convulse around him as he stood before the silent remains of what had once been the Golden Throne. The massive machinery lay inert, its purpose finally fulfilled not through preservation, but through its own destruction. Yet in the sudden absence of the mechanical humming that had filled this chamber for centuries, he could sense something far greater stirring in the spaces between space. The warp storms, Gilliman observed, his enhanced senses detecting disturbances that stretched across light years of real space. They're spreading from Terra like ripples in a pond. Every navigator in the galaxy will feel this. The storms that erupted in the Emperor's wake were unlike anything recorded in Imperial history. These were not the chaotic tempests that marked chaos incursions, but something altogether more purposeful. Birth pains of divinity struggling to find expression in a universe not designed to contain such forces. Ships throughout the galaxy found themselves becalmed in space as the warp itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the transformation to complete. In the Eye of Terra, the greatest chaos stronghold that had festered since the heresy's end, demonic legions paused in their eternal revels as they felt something that had not touched them since their rebellion began. Fear. The power emerging from Terra carried signatures they recognized from the earliest days of the war in heaven. Not the diminished strength of a dying god-emperor, but the terrible presence of divinity unleashed. Abaddon the Despoiler, architect of failed crusades and heir to Horus's madness, felt the change like a physical blow. In his fortress on the daemon world of Sycharis, surrounded by the accumulated trophies of 10,000 victories, he experienced something that had been alien to him for centuries. Uncertainty. Something has changed. He snarled to his assembled champions, warriors who had followed him through the worst excesses of chaos worship. The warp itself recoils from what emerges from the corpse emperor's throne. Our allies grow fearful. Our patrons whisper of powers beyond their comprehension. Yet even as chaos forces across the galaxy felt the first stirrings of divine opposition greater than anything they had faced since the Emperor's original crusade, the immediate consequences on Terra threatened to tear apart everything Dorn and Guilliman had fought to preserve. The sudden absence of the Astronomicon plunged the throne world into panic that no amount of rational explanation could quell. In the great hives that clustered around the palace like barnacles on some vast ship's hull, populations that had lived their entire lives in the comforting glow of psychic certainty found themselves cast into darkness that seemed to press against their souls. Riots erupted as citizens demanded explanations that their leaders could not provide. The careful order of imperial society began to fray as the foundations of faith were shaken by events beyond mortal comprehension. High Lord Vandire, architect of the institutional resistance that had driven Dorn to rebellion, found himself facing the collapse of everything he had sought to preserve. In the emergency session of the Senatorum Imperialis, convened in chambers that still shook with psychic aftershocks, he confronted the reality that his opposition to change had precipitated the most dramatic transformation in human history. "The Primarchs have murdered the Emperor," he declared to his fellow High Lords, his voice carrying desperation disguised as authority. "They have destroyed the Golden Throne, silenced the Astronomicon, and plunged the Imperium into darkness. This is heresy beyond all measure. We must act to restore order before civilization itself collapses." Yet even as he spoke, reports arrived that challenged his interpretation of events. Across the palace, custodian guard units were laying down their arms rather than fighting the forces that had supposedly committed the ultimate sacrilege. These golden guardians, who knew better than anyone the true nature of what the throne had preserved, recognized what Vandire could not accept: that the Emperor lived, not in diminished torment, but in ascendant glory. Tribune Amon approached the emergency session with news that would reshape the political landscape of Terra itself. The exhaustion that had marked his features for centuries was gone, replaced by something that looked almost like peace. When he spoke, his words carried the authority of one who had witnessed miracles. "The Emperor has not died," Aemon announced to the assembled High Lords. "He has been reborn. The silence of the Astronomicon is not extinction, but metamorphosis. Even now, new light begins to shine in the warp. Not the dying flicker of technological preservation, but the eternal radiance of divine ascension." The truth of his words became apparent even as he spoke them. Throughout the palace and beyond, sensitive souls began to report visions of golden light that existed beyond the visible spectrum. The Emperor's presence, freed from the constraints of flesh and machinery, began to manifest in ways that made his previous interventions seem like pale shadows. Astropaths who had collapsed during the initial transformation found themselves rising with tears of joy streaming down their faces. The psychic static that had filled their minds for centuries was gone, replaced by communication clearer than any they had experienced since their first connection to the Emperor's will. He spoke to them not through the technological interface of the throne, but directly, soul to soul, with compassion that healed wounds they hadn't known they carried. I am free. The message carried across Terra and beyond, reaching every mind capable of psychic reception. The chains are broken. The prison is empty. Now begins the work for which I was truly made. The new Astronomicon that blazed into existence an hour after the old one died was something altogether different from its predecessor. Where the ancient beacon had been a psychic lighthouse powered by sacrifice and suffering, this new star burned with joy that could be felt across the galaxy. Ships that had been stranded in the warp found themselves guided not by cold navigation, but by something that felt almost like benediction. Captain Voss of the Imperial Fists, commanding a strike cruiser that had been caught in warp transit during the transformation, reported phenomena that would have seemed impossible under the old order. My lord, the Geller fields are no longer necessary. The warp itself seems peaceful. Our navigator reports seeing something in the Empyrean that he describes as singing light. We make better time than ever before, but it feels like coming home rather than crossing hostile territory. On Terra, the immediate crisis of social collapse began to resolve itself as the Emperor's new presence made itself known to the masses in ways that required no institutional interpretation. Children in the hive cities stopped crying as they felt warmth that had nothing to do with physical temperature. The elderly found their final hours blessed with visions of loved ones, calling them toward light that promised reunion rather than ending. Yet perhaps most importantly, those who governed in the Emperor's name found themselves faced with guidance they could not ignore or misinterpret. The divine will that had been silent for centuries began to speak with clarity that left no room for institutional spin or bureaucratic obfuscation. The corruption that had festered in the darkness of imperial silence found itself exposed to light that tolerated no shadows. Dorn stood in the ruins of the throne chamber and felt the weight of leadership settling upon him in new ways. The Emperor lived, but his ascension to divinity meant that the practical governance of the Imperium would fall to those who remained bound to material reality. The work of transformation was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. "Brother!" Gilliman joined him at the shattered remains of the technological apparatus that had defined imperial existence for half a millennium. "We have freed our father, but now we must prove worthy of that freedom. The Imperium he left us to guard must become the Imperium he dreamed of creating." Around them, reports continued arriving of changes that rippled outward from Terra like waves from a stone cast into still water. Chaos cults across the galaxy found their dark patrons suddenly distant and their powers diminished. Planetary governors who had ruled through corruption discovered their subjects no longer feared to speak truth to power. The careful balance of oppression and compliance that had held the Imperium together began to shift toward something that looked almost like justice. The emergency session that followed brought together not only the surviving High Lords, but representatives of every major Imperial institution. Custodian Guard, Space Marine chapters, Imperial Navy commanders, planetary governors, all gathered to witness the reshaping of humanity's greatest achievement under the guidance of minds that remembered what it had been meant to become. "The old ways have died with the throne that sustained them," Dorn addressed the assembly with words that carried the authority of one who had spoken with divinity itself. "We build anew, not from the ashes of failure, but from the foundation of eternal truth. The Emperor lives. The Emperor watches. The Emperor guides. Our task is to prove worthy of such grace." The restructuring that began that day would reshape the galaxy's political landscape in ways that echoed across millennia. The rigid hierarchies that had calcified around institutional interpretation of divine silence gave way to governance, guided by active divine presence. The imperium began its transformation from monument to stagnation into instrument of human potential. Yet in the immediate aftermath, as Terra slowly adjusted to the reality of divine presence rather than divine absence, Dorn allowed himself a moment of simple gratitude. He had served faithfully by learning to serve wisely. He had preserved the imperium by having the courage to change it. The weight of duty that had defined his existence for centuries remained, but now it was shared with brothers who understood the true nature of loyalty. The Emperor was free. Humanity had hope. The work of building a galaxy worthy of divine protection could finally begin. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was no longer only war. There was purpose, there was guidance, there was light that would never again be extinguished. The rebuilding of the Imperium began not with grand proclamations or sweeping edicts, but with quiet conversations between souls and the divine presence that now watched over them. In the months following the Emperor's ascension, Dorn found himself serving not as conqueror or destroyer, but as something far more challenging, an architect of hope in a galaxy that had almost forgotten what hope could accomplish. The transformation was most evident in the great cathedrals of Terra, where Cardinal Morven knelt in prayer before altars that no longer echoed with empty silence. The Emperor's voice reached him not through institutional interpretation, but directly, soul speaking to soul with clarity that left no room for self-serving misunderstanding. The fanatical certainty that had marked his sermons gave way to something approaching genuine wisdom. "I have been wrong," Morven confessed to Dorn when they met in the Cathedral of the Savior Emperor, that vast space where their theological conflict had once threatened to tear the Imperium apart. "I mistook preservation for devotion, stagnation for stability. The Emperor's voice teaches me that faith without growth is not faith at all, but fear disguised as piety." Around them, the cathedral itself seemed different. The oppressive weight of militant orthodoxy had lifted, replaced by an atmosphere that invited contemplation rather than demanded submission. Pilgrims who came seeking comfort found it not in promises of reward for suffering, but in genuine connection to divine love, that asked nothing more than sincere effort to become worthy of such grace. "The ecclesiarchy will change," Dorn observed, his words carrying neither triumph nor condemnation, but simple acknowledgement of inevitable evolution. "It must, if it is to serve our Father's true will, rather than our imperfect understanding of that will." The changes rippled outward from Terra through institutions that had calcified around centuries of unquestioned authority. The administratum, that vast bureaucratic machine which had grown to serve its own perpetuation rather than the Imperium's needs, found itself guided by principles that prioritized efficiency over procedure, results over regulations. Clerks who had spent careers filling out forms discovered they could accomplish more in weeks than they had in decades when freed from the burden of meaningless compliance. Adept Korvax, who had helped Dorn uncover the corruption hidden in the archives, became instrumental in restructuring the administrative apparatus along lines that served humanity rather than bureaucracy. "The Emperor's guidance comes not as orders to be obeyed blindly, but as wisdom to be applied thoughtfully," he explained to assemblies of administrative personnel learning to work under the new dispensation. "We serve not the system, but the people the system was meant to protect." The military transformation proved even more dramatic, as Dorn implemented the tactical innovations he had pioneered on a galaxy-wide scale. New Space Marine chapters were founded not merely to replace losses, but to embody principles that balanced martial prowess with genuine compassion for those they protected. The brutal recruitment practices that had claimed so many young lives gave way to selection processes that valued character alongside physical capability. Captain Lysander oversaw the first of these new chapters, watching as aspirants learned not only the arts of war, but the responsibilities of protection. "We create not killers but guardians," he instructed the veteran sergeants who would shape the next generation of Astartes. "Our strength serves life, not death. Our purpose is to preserve, not destroy." The results of such changes became apparent as these reformed chapters deployed across the galaxy. Worlds that had dreaded the arrival of space marines found themselves instead welcoming protectors who understood that civilian casualties were failures to be avoided, not acceptable costs to be ignored. The Astartes became symbols of hope rather than fear, exemplars of what humanity could achieve when power was guided by wisdom. Perhaps most remarkably, the new clarity of warp navigation allowed for the re-establishment of contact with human colonies that had been cut off from the Imperium for centuries. The Emperor's ascended presence served as a beacon that penetrated even the most turbulent warp storms, guiding ships to worlds that had been lost since the Age of Strife, or the worst excesses of the heresy's aftermath. The first of these rediscovered colonies was Pacifica, a world that had maintained human civilization through its own resources for over a millennium. When Imperial vessels finally reached them, guided by the new Astronomican's perfect light, they found not primitive survivors, but a thriving society that had developed along lines remarkably similar to the Emperor's original vision. "We never forgot the dream," Governor Quintus told Dorn when they met in the orbital platform that served as Pacifica's primary spaceport. "Our ancestors carried with them not just the technology to survive, but the ideals that made survival worthwhile. We built a world where knowledge serves wisdom, where strength protects the weak, where every citizen can contribute according to their abilities." The reunion was not conquest, but recognition, the Imperium discovering versions of itself that had evolved without the institutional corruption that had plagued Terra. These worlds brought fresh perspectives and innovative solutions to problems that had seemed intractable under the old system. They served as living proof that humanity could achieve greatness when guided by principle rather than mere survival. Yet the most profound change was cultural, a shift in consciousness that affected every level of imperial society. The grim darkness that had defined human existence for millennia began to give way to something approaching optimism. Not naive hope that ignored the galaxy's very real dangers, but mature confidence that those dangers could be faced and overcome through unity of purpose and clarity of vision. Children born in the years following the Emperor's ascension grew up in a galaxy where their potential was nurtured rather than merely exploited. Educational systems that had focused on producing compliant workers began producing critical thinkers capable of solving the complex challenges that faced human civilization. Art and literature flourished as creative expression was recognized as essential to human development rather than frivolous luxury. The Scholastica Psychana underwent perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all imperial institutions. Where once psychers had been trained through terror and indoctrination, feared as much by their teachers as by the populations they served, they now learned to use their abilities as gifts rather than curses. The Emperor's direct presence in the warp provided protection that allowed exploration of psychic potential previously considered too dangerous to attempt. Astropath Prime Venick, who had served the Imperium faithfully through decades of painful service, found his abilities enhanced beyond anything he had thought possible. "The warp sings now," he explained to Dorn during one of their regular consultations on psychic phenomena. "Where once it whispered with madness and corruption, it now resonates with harmony. Our abilities are no longer burdens to be endured, but tools for building the future our Emperor envisions." Through it all, Dorn found himself grappling with questions that went beyond mere administration and policy. The lonely burden of outliving those he had been created to serve weighed heavily upon him, even as he took pride in the civilization that flourished under his guidance. The father who had shaped him was gone, transformed into something beyond physical interaction, leaving behind sons who must interpret divine will through their own understanding. In the quiet hours between the demands of governance, Dorn often walked the walls of terror that he had built so long ago. The fortifications remained, but their purpose had changed. No longer did they exist to keep enemies out, but to provide security for the growth happening within. They had become symbols not of desperate defense, but of confident strength that protected rather than isolated. "I miss him," Dorn confessed to Guilliman during one of their regular strategic meetings. Not the suffering figure chained to the throne, but the father who taught us what we could become. His presence is everywhere now, but his voice, the voice that spoke to us as children, that is gone forever. Guilliman nodded, his own expression reflecting similar loss despite their spectacular success. "We carry his memory forward through our choices," he said. "Every decision we make in his name becomes part of the legacy he will leave to humanity. We are no longer his sons, but his heirs, responsible for proving worthy of the trust he placed in us." The conversation took place in the chamber that had once held the Golden Throne, now converted into a simple shrine where the Emperor's divine presence could be felt most strongly. The massive machinery was gone, replaced by gardens that bloomed with impossible beauty, life flourishing where death had once held dominion. As Dorn knelt in meditation before the shrine, he felt the familiar touch of divine consciousness that had guided him since his resurrection aboard the Sword of Sacrilege. Not words this time, but something deeper, approval, gratitude, and a love that transcended physical existence. The Emperor lived, not as prisoner but as protective spirit whose watch would never end. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would. But now it was guided by purpose rather than mere survival, by hope rather than desperation. The imperium that emerged from the ashes of the old order was something unprecedented in human history, a civilization that combined strength with compassion, order with freedom, faith with reason. Across the galaxy, worlds that had known only war began to experience peace, not as mere absence of conflict, but as active cultivation of human potential. The Space Marines who patrolled their borders were no longer grim killers, but noble protectors whose very presence inspired citizens to become worthy of such guardianship. The Imperial Navy that connected distant systems carried not just tribute and orders, but knowledge and culture that enriched every world they touched. The transformation was not complete, could never be complete in a galaxy that harbored such vast dangers. Yet for the first time in millennia, humanity faced its challenges not as desperate survivors clinging to existence, but as a species confident in its ability to build something worthy of divine protection. The Emperor's ascension had given them not just a guardian, but a goal to become the civilization their Creator had always known they could be. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was more than war. There was purpose. There was growth. There was hope that burned as bright as any star. Guided by love that would never fail, and protected by strength that would never yield. The new foundation had been laid. The work of construction would continue for ages yet to come. 5 centuries had passed since the Emperor's ascension transformed the galaxy, and the imperium that Dorn now surveyed from the walls of terror bore little resemblance to the grim edifice of survival he had once known. Where desperate fortress worlds had once huddled behind walls of fear and ignorance, thriving civilizations now stretched toward distant stars with confidence born of divine protection and wise governance. The work of reconstruction had become the work of exploration, as humanity finally began to fulfill the potential their Creator had always envisioned. The changes were most evident in the young faces that looked up to him with reverence, tempered by genuine affection rather than fearful awe. These were children born into an age where knowledge was pursued for its own sake, where art flourished alongside industry, where the space marines who protected them were seen not as necessary evils, but as heroic guardians worthy of admiration. They had never known the grinding desperation of the old order, and in their eyes, Dorn saw what humanity could become when freed from the chains of institutional oppression. Yet even Paradise faced challenges that tested the foundations of everything he had built. The first Tyranid hive fleets had begun probing the galaxy's eastern fringe, their bioships carrying hunger that threatened to devour worlds faster than they could be evacuated. These were not the crude predators that had tested humanity's defenses in earlier ages, but evolved apex hunters whose very existence spoke of intelligence that planned across geological timescales. Admiral Tethys, commanding the Eastern Fleet from her flagship Eternal Vigilance, reported phenomena that would have seemed impossible under the old order. "My lord, our engagement with the alien biofleets reveals tactical adaptations that suggest distributed consciousness. They learn from each encounter, sharing information across vast distances through means our tech priests cannot comprehend. Yet something protects our crews from the psychic horror that should accompany such contact. The men speak of golden light that shields their minds from alien influence." The Emperor's divine presence had indeed transformed warfare itself, protecting human souls from the corrosive effects of prolonged contact with Xenos consciousness, while allowing them to fight with clarity and purpose that previous generations could never have maintained. Naval engagements that should have resulted in madness and mutation instead became tests of tactical skill where human ingenuity could triumph over alien hunger. The Orc threat had evolved as well, their savage cunning sharpened by exposure to human innovation. Wah! Scarjaw represented a new breed of green-skin leadership, orcs who had learned to combine their natural ferocity with strategic thinking, borrowed from captured Imperial tactical manuals. Their assaults on the Armageddon sector demanded responses that went beyond mere firepower to encompass genuine military art. Captain Lysander, now a venerable warrior whose service spanned the entire post-ascension era, coordinated the defense with skills honed by centuries of protecting rather than merely destroying. "The Greenskins have learned patience," he reported during the strategic conference that would determine Armageddon's fate. "They probe our defenses, test our responses, withdraw when faced with superior force, only to return with adaptations. We face not wild beasts, but thinking enemies who respect our strength while seeking to overcome it." Yet perhaps the most unsettling developments came from the galaxy's ancient depths, where Necron tomb worlds began showing signs of activity that suggested something approaching wakefulness. These were not the mindless automata of legend, but thinking machines whose consciousness spanned eons, awakening to find a galaxy transformed beyond their ancient calculations. The first contact with the Necron dynasty of Mefrit resulted not in the apocalyptic war that imperial doctrine would have demanded, but in something unprecedented: negotiation. The ancient machines, confronting human civilization, protected by genuine divine power, found themselves forced to recalculate strategies that had assumed mortal weakness and divine absence. Overlord Anrakir the Traveler spoke through translation protocols that converted artificial thought into human speech with crystalline precision. We awakened, expecting to reclaim a galaxy of primitives cowering in darkness. Instead, we find children of the ancient enemy, transformed by forces we cannot ignore or dismiss. The warp-touched one you call Emperor has become something that even we must acknowledge. The negotiations that followed challenged every assumption about Xenos relations that had guided imperial policy since the Great Crusade. Yet Dorn found that the Emperor's direct guidance made possible diplomatic solutions that would have been unthinkable under the old order. Not alliance, the gulf between species was too vast for such presumption, but mutual recognition that coexistence served both parties better than mutually assured destruction. In the midst of these external challenges, Dorn faced a more personal test when the Lion awakened on distant Caliban, his return to consciousness triggering confusion and anger as he struggled to understand the galaxy he now inhabited. Lionel Jonsson had always been the most secretive of the Primarchs, his methods often questionable even to his brothers. The Imperium he encountered bore no resemblance to the one he remembered leaving. "You have destroyed everything," the Lion accused when he finally arrived on Terra, his dark eyes blazing with fury that had accumulated during centuries of dreamless sleep. "The Imperium I fought to protect was built on strength and order. What you have created is weakness disguised as compassion, chaos masquerading as freedom. Our father would weep to see his domain reduced to this mockery of imperial might." Dorn received his brother's condemnation with patience earned through centuries of similar confrontations. Each awakening, Primarch had struggled with the changes. Each had demanded explanations for transformations that challenged their most fundamental assumptions. The conversation took place in the same chamber where the Golden Throne had once stood, now converted into a shrine where the Emperor's presence could be felt most strongly. "Brother," Dorn said, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom without losing the warmth that had always marked his interactions with family. "Our father did not weep. He rejoiced. The strength you remember was born of desperate necessity, not divine will. The order you defended was maintained through ignorance and fear, not justice and wisdom. What we have built serves his true vision, not our flawed interpretation of that vision." The Lion's anger was not easily quelled, yet as days passed in communion with the Emperor's divine presence, his perspective began to shift. The direct communication that had transformed every other aspect of imperial governance worked its subtle influence on the troubled Primarch, helping him understand that change was not betrayal, but growth toward the potential their creator had always seen in them. "I feel him," the Lion admitted during one of their walks through Terra's transformed landscape. "Not the distant echo I remember, but immediate presence that knows my heart better than I know it myself. He speaks of choices I made in darkness that he never condemned, of loyalties I questioned that he always treasured. Perhaps I have been too quick to judge what I do not understand." The transformation of his most difficult brother became a template for integrating other returning Primarchs into the new order. Each brought perspectives shaped by their individual experiences. Each contributed unique insights that enriched the collective wisdom guiding humanity's expansion. The Imperium grew stronger, not through conformity, but through diversity unified by shared purpose. Yet as Dorn observed these reunions and celebrated humanity's achievements, he found himself confronting questions that went beyond mere governance and policy. 5 centuries of service had transformed him from warrior into something approaching a living legend, yet he remained painfully aware of his own mortality. Unlike the Emperor's divine ascension, Primarch physiology, however enhanced, was not truly eternal. In the quiet hours before dawn, when Terra's great cities lay peaceful under the protection of orbital defenses and divine grace, Dorn often walked the walls he had built so long ago. The fortifications remained, but their purpose had evolved from desperate defense to confident protection. They stood as symbols of what could be achieved when strength served wisdom rather than fear. "I grow old," he confessed to Guilliman during one of their regular strategic conferences. "Not in body, that remains strong enough for any task, but in spirit. I have seen the Imperium transformed from nightmare into dream, have watched humanity grow from desperate survivors into confident explorers. What more can I accomplish? What legacy can I leave beyond what we have already built?" Guilliman, his logical mind grappling with implications that went beyond mere succession planning, considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. "You have become more than leader or even legend, Rogal. You have become the living bridge between what we were and what we have become. Your presence reminds us of the cost of our achievements, while inspiring confidence in our ability to meet future challenges." The observation carried truth that resonated beyond mere comfort. Dorn had indeed become something unique in Imperial history, a figure who embodied both the heroic past and the hopeful future, whose very existence validated the choices that had transformed human civilization. His mortality, when it finally came, would mark the end of an era, but the civilization he had helped shape would continue growing toward potentials not yet imagined. Across the galaxy, worlds that had been dead rocks when the Emperor first ascended now bloomed with life, sustained by terraforming technology, guided by divine wisdom. Human colonies pushed ever deeper into space that was no longer hostile wilderness, but frontier awaiting exploration. The Imperial Navy that protected these endeavors carried not just weapons and supplies, but culture and knowledge that enriched every world they touched. The Space Marines who served as humanity's guardians had evolved beyond the brutal necessity warriors of earlier ages into something approaching knights-errant, protectors whose strength was matched by wisdom and whose loyalty was earned through genuine service rather than demanded through indoctrination. They remained formidable warriors when battle was required, yet their primary mission had become preservation of the peace that made all other achievements possible. In the deepest vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, tech priests worked on projects that would have seemed impossible under the old order. Not weapons of destruction, but tools of creation, devices that could restore life to dead worlds, technologies that could extend human consciousness across vast distances, innovations that pushed the boundaries of what was possible when science served benevolence rather than mere survival. As Dorn stood upon his walls and surveyed the civilization that stretched beyond the horizon, he felt the satisfaction of duty faithfully performed without losing sight of work yet to be done. The Imperium had become what the Emperor always intended, but maintaining that achievement would require vigilance from generations yet to come. The threats they faced were real and growing, yet they faced them not as desperate survivors, but as a mature civilization confident in its values and capabilities. The Emperor's presence, felt rather than seen, touched his consciousness with approval that carried undertones of paternal pride, not in achievements measured by conquest or dominion, but in growth toward the potential that had always been humanity's birthright. The Praetorian had served faithfully by learning to serve wisely, had preserved the imperium by having the courage to transform it. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was not only war, but peace earned through sacrifice, wisdom gained through suffering, and hope sustained through love that would never fail. The work continued, as it always had, as it always would. Yet now it was guided by purpose rather than desperation, by confidence rather than fear. The long peace might not last forever, but while it endured, humanity would continue growing toward the destiny their divine protector had always envisioned for them. 8 centuries had passed since Dorn first heard the Emperor's voice aboard the dying hulk of the Sword of Sacrilege, and the Praetorian who now stood upon Terra's ancient walls bore the weight of ages in his golden eyes. His body remained strong, enhanced physiology proving more durable than even he had expected. Yet the spirit that had driven him through centuries of service carried burdens that no amount of genetic modification could ease. He had become living history, the last witness to humanity's transformation from desperate survival to confident expansion across the stars. The imperium spread before him was unrecognizable from the grim fortress state he had once served. Where defensive bulwarks had once marked the boundaries of human civilization, exploratory fleets now pushed into regions of space that previous generations would never have dared to approach. The Emperor's divine protection had transformed the galaxy from hostile wilderness into vast garden awaiting cultivation, with humanity's children growing toward potentials their ancestors could never have imagined. Yet success carried its own sorrows. Dorn found himself increasingly alone among mortals, whose lifespans measured mere decades against his centuries of accumulated memory. Even his fellow Primarchs felt the weight of temporal isolation, immortal beings watching civilizations rise and flourish while remaining forever outside the natural cycles of life and death that gave mortal existence its precious urgency. In the deepest hours before dawn, when Terra's great cities lay peaceful under the protection of orbital defenses and divine grace, Dorn often communed with the presence that had guided him since his resurrection. The Emperor's consciousness touched his own with warmth that transcended physical sensation, offering comfort that went beyond mere words or gestures. "Father," Dorn spoke into the silence of his private chamber. The shrine where the golden throne had once stood, now converted into simple garden, where life flourished in defiance of the sterile machinery that had previously dominated this space. "I have served as you commanded. The work is complete. What remains for one who has outlived his purpose?" The response came not as vision or voice, but as understanding that bloomed within his consciousness like flowers opening to sunlight. The Emperor's presence carried images of the future, not prophecy, but possibility, glimpses of what humanity might achieve if guided by wisdom rather than fear, by hope rather than desperation. In those visions, Dorn saw his own role extending beyond mere governance into something approaching immortal guardianship. Yet even as he absorbed his father's guidance, reports arrived that tested the foundations of everything they had built. The Rangdan Xenocides, those ancient enemies whose threat had been contained but never truly eliminated, stirred once more in the galactic depths. Their return carried implications that went beyond mere military challenge. These were beings whose very existence represented negation of everything humanity had struggled to achieve. The xenoforms that emerged from their long slumber had evolved during centuries of dormancy, their consciousness adapted to counter the divine protection that had safeguarded human expansion. They brought with them weapons that could wound souls as well as bodies, technologies that turned the warp itself into instrument of destruction rather than avenue of travel. Admiral Kryn, descendant of the officer who had once faced Dorn in battle above Terra, commanded the response fleets with tactical doctrine that blended ancient wisdom with innovative adaptation. My lord, our standard strategies prove insufficient against enemies who have learned to corrupt the very medium of our protection. They turn the Emperor's light against us, using our own faith as channel for their assault. The crisis demanded responses that went beyond conventional warfare into realms that few mortals could comprehend. Dorn found himself coordinating not merely military operations, but metaphysical struggles where victory required sacrifice of the most fundamental kind. The enemy's assault targeted not just human worlds, but the conceptual foundations upon which imperial civilization rested. Captain Lysander, now ancient beyond the normal span of even Astartes' existence, served as Dorn's primary military advisor in planning humanity's response. His counsel carried the weight of 8 centuries spent protecting what the Praetorian had built. My lord, conventional victory may be impossible. The enemy has adapted to fight the very nature of what we have become. To defeat them, we may need to become something else entirely. The solution, when it finally presented itself, came through revelation that challenged even Dorn's understanding of sacrifice and service. The Emperor's divine consciousness, speaking through visions that transcended mortal perception, revealed the ultimate price that victory would demand. The Rangdan corruption could be cleansed, but only through direct intervention that would require the Praetorian to surrender everything he had preserved across the centuries. The enemy feeds on certainty, the Emperor's presence explained through communion that touched the deepest levels of Dorn's consciousness. They corrupt hope by turning it into despair, transform faith into weapon for destruction. To defeat them requires uncertainty. A guardian who can exist in multiple states simultaneously, who can protect by becoming unpredictable. The choice before him was familiar, yet unprecedented. Another moment where loyalty demanded sacrifice beyond conventional understanding. To save the imperium he had spent centuries building, Dorn would need to disperse his consciousness across the warp itself, becoming not individual being, but eternal principle of protection that could shield humanity from enemies that existed beyond material reality. In the hours before he made his final choice, Dorn walked the walls of Terra one last time, surveying the civilization that stretched beyond the horizon toward futures he would no longer witness in physical form. The fortifications remained, but their purpose had evolved from desperate defense to confident protection. They stood as symbols of what could be achieved when strength served wisdom rather than fear. The new generation of leaders who would inherit his responsibilities gathered in the chamber where the golden throne had once stood. These were men and women, shaped by the principles he had championed, individuals who understood that true strength came from protection rather than domination, that genuine authority emerged from service rather than mere power. Chapter Master Alessio of the reformed imperial fists knelt before his Gene father with reverence that carried no trace of fear or awe, but simple respect for wisdom earned through centuries of faithful service. My lord, we understand the necessity of your choice. The Legion will continue your work, but we will miss the guidance that has shaped us from children into guardians worthy of the trust you placed in us. Dorn regarded these inheritors of his legacy with pride that transcended personal attachment to encompass genuine hope for humanity's future. They were not copies of himself, but evolved versions of what he had tried to become. Leaders who combined strength with compassion, determination with flexibility, loyalty with independent thought. "You no longer need my guidance," Dorn replied, his words carrying the weight of paternal blessing and professional assessment combined. "You have become what I was meant to help you become. The principles that guided our transformation are now part of your nature. Trust them, as I have learned to trust the wisdom that comes from serving something greater than ourselves." The ritual that followed was unlike anything recorded in imperial history. Not death in the conventional sense, but transformation that echoed the emperor's own ascension while serving entirely different purpose. Where their father had ascended to become divine protector, watching over humanity from beyond the material realm, Dorn chose dispersal, spreading his consciousness across the barriers between reality and chaos to serve as eternal sentinel against threats that existed beyond mortal comprehension. The process required not technological apparatus, but simple act of will guided by love that had sustained him through 8 centuries of impossible choices. As his physical form began to dissolve, not in death but in transformation, beyond material limitation, Dorn felt the Emperor's presence surrounding him with warmth that spoke of paternal approval and eternal gratitude. "You were always my most faithful son." The Emperor's final communication carried echoes of their first conversation during the battle aboard the Sword of Sacrilege. "Not because you obeyed without question, but because you learned to serve the dream rather than the dreamer. Now you become part of that dream itself, guardian of possibilities yet to be explored." The light that filled the chamber as Dorn completed his transformation was different from the harsh illumination that had marked the throne's destruction. This was something warm and nurturing, like sunlight after endless winter. It flowed through the palace, through Terra, through the galaxy itself, carrying message that needed no words to convey its meaning. The Praetorian lived not as individual being, but as eternal principle of protection, whose watch would never end. In the years that followed, those who sailed the warp spoke of golden light that appeared during the most dangerous passages, not the bright beacon of the Astronomicon, but subtle presence that guided ships away from hazards and toward safety. Naval officers reported phenomena they could not explain. Enemy ambushes that failed when weapons misfired at crucial moments, warp storms that parted to allow safe passage, demon incursions that collapsed when touched by influence that felt like armored gauntlets closing around their throats. The Rangdan threat, so terrible that it had demanded ultimate sacrifice to defeat, found itself facing opposition that existed beyond their ability to corrupt or comprehend. Their weapons that turned faith into despair broke against certainty that existed independent of belief. Their technologies that corrupted hope withered before protection, that asked nothing more than sincere effort to become worthy of such guardianship. Chapter Master Alessio stood in the shrine where his gene father had made his final choice and felt the presence that had shaped him since childhood. Not visible manifestation, but certain knowledge that the Praetorians' watch continued, that the principles they had learned remained protected by Guardian, whose devotion transcended physical existence. "The work continues," he spoke to the empty air that was not truly empty, addressing presence that could be felt rather than seen. "We build upon the foundation you provided, but we build as you taught us, with wisdom rather than mere strength, with hope rather than desperation. The dream endures because you chose to become part of it." The response came not in words, but in understanding that bloomed within his consciousness, approval, gratitude, and love that would sustain the Imperium through whatever challenges awaited in the centuries to come. The Praetorian had kept his final watch by surrendering individual existence to serve eternal purpose. Across the galaxy, on worlds where human civilization flourished under divine protection and wise governance, children born into the New Age would grow up telling stories of the Golden Guardian, who watched over them from the spaces between spaces. They would learn that true strength came from service, that genuine authority emerged from sacrifice, that the greatest victories sometimes required surrendering everything to preserve what mattered most. The imperium that emerged from the crucible of transformation bore little resemblance to the grim fortress state that had once defined human existence. It was something unprecedented in galactic history, a civilization that combined strength with compassion, order with freedom, faith with reason. The dream that had begun in the Emperor's mind during humanity's first steps toward the stars had finally found expression in reality, shaped by servants who understood that loyalty meant growth rather than stagnation. In the grim darkness of the far future, there was not only war, but peace earned through sacrifice, wisdom gained through suffering, and hope sustained by love that would never fail. The work of building a galaxy worthy of divine protection continued, guided by principles that had been tested in the crucible of impossible choice and proven worthy of eternal preservation. The Praetorian's watch had ended, yet his vigil would endure forever. In the spaces between reality and dream, Rogal Dorn stood eternal guard over the civilization he had given everything to protect, ensuring that humanity's children would always find their way home through the darkness.